Somewhere in Tokyo, suddenly, all the people were bombarded with messages on their cell phones and were confused, not understanding what was happening. Even some people who had left their phones on silent mode were surprised because their phones were ringing. And on the screens appeared a bizarre, strange symbol that they did not recognize. It was a very strange scene, and they couldn't say why. Suddenly, the symbol alone appeared outside the screen in front of their faces, and through it came a hand holding a sword. People froze in surprise at the same time, especially when one of them was killed right before their eyes. A woman fell seated to the ground and screamed, as from within the symbol emerged the rest of the body of the being who wielded the sword. From various other symbols, other frightening creatures emerged, and people ran away without knowing what was happening or what those monsters were. Other people didn't even have time to escape and were trapped among the monsters, only able to cry for help before facing their final moments. Humanity was brought to ruin by the monsters that suddenly appeared, and no one was able to react. Those who managed to survive always lived in fear of the monsters, but there were still those who fought to restore the peaceful days that had been taken away. These people also wielded swords to slay the monsters and save others before it was too late. One of them was Daichi, a swordsman who had finished his duties for the day and thought that was all there was to do in that place. When he looked back, he asked Himari how she was doing, and the girl replied that her attacks weren't working. But he was supposed to be the last of the monsters in that place. Himari was a level 16 Lancer who was facing a level 64 Guadro. Unfortunately, her attacks took very little HP from the Guadro, who had over 1,000 life points while she was at such a low level. The monster charged at her again, but it was Daichi who defended her from the attack before it could strike her. He asked if she was okay, while Himari was still amazed by her companion's defense. Daichi mentioned that the monster might have magical defense or perhaps could only be defeated with his own weapon. That might have been the case, and he intended to take the weapon right there to defeat it, and that was how he managed to seize its arms. The protagonist who defeated the monster did so without much difficulty, also noticing that Himari was injured and wanted to heal her. In this case, he was a swordsman, but he was at level 999, that's much stronger than her, with his stats maxed out. Himari received healing magic and assured him she was safe. They had now finished taking care of everything there. The Lancer was impressed because he managed to defeat so many creatures on his own that they could move on and head to the next tower. They would slay the boss in a single strike. The duo was walking toward the tower in the direction of the monster's nest. They were just getting started, and the written story continued with Daichi saying they were just beginning, and he brandished his sword again. They intended to fight for the good of humanity, and the writer of the story continued narrating as his protagonist shouted gloriously. All this while approaching the dungeon tower along with Himari. This was the story he wrote called World Raiders. The writer, who had finished writing what he thought was best, an aspiring novelist named Tsurugi Ariku, sighed. After finishing writing, he stood up, satisfied with the ending because it seemed good enough. He could publish it after a revision. When he looked at the watch on his wrist, he realized he was late and ran out because the supermarket was supposed to have a sale that day. He still had to do that week's shopping, and later he left the store with the groceries he had managed to buy. If he ate twice a day, he thought he could survive for a few weeks. Anyway, he still had some knack for handling life on his own. When he sat down, he smelled grilled meat coming from a restaurant and drifting out of the window and pretended he was savoring real food even though he was eating something cheap. He was certainly a misunderstood genius who could satisfy his hunger by eating simpler things like that. That's what he thought, but Riku still felt he was starving and looked to the side when he saw a cat mewing at him. It seemed that even the little cat was hungry, so he offered a piece of what he was eating for the animal to eat. The cat shared its piece of food with another cat, and Riku thought about friendship just like his two characters, Himari and Daichi. That made him want to go home to continue writing his own story, still thinking about Himari. He remembered his time at school when he used to write in his notebook and people whispered among themselves about how he was always glued to it and was a real nerd. But the one who approached him after noticing Riku's grumpy expression was his childhood friend named Hinomoto Himari. She asked if he was working on a new story and even wanted him to add his superhero princess as a reference to her too. That caught him by surprise and he asked why, not wanting her to get too close to him, but Himari ignored that. She would get close anyway because they had made a promise. One day he would become a novelist, and she would work at a publishing company to help release his story. That was what they agreed on from the start, and Riku agreed because he was aware of it. So Himari insisted he get started right away. During school breaks, he worked on the plot of his novel together with Himari. Those moments were the happiest of his life. Time passed, and the protagonist was riding his bike when he saw Himari ringing the doorbell at a large house. Several other girls came out to greet Himari, and Riku continued on his way riding his bike to school. Time went by, and he regularly saw Himari walking with some girls go into the diner near the station to have fun. The truth was that she had many things he himself didn't have, and yet Himari always made time to help guide the protagonist with his stories. She acted like an editor, suggesting that the friend of the character in his story should think differently and adding more detailed input. Himari had a charismatic personality, many friends, and a carefree life most of the time. When he compared himself to her, who had everything he didn't, it made him feel even more miserable than usual. Then one day, Himari started wanting to talk about the book like always, but the protagonist refused and wanted to leave because he had to go to work. He was having a tough month and couldn't afford to be late, ignoring his childhood friend who tried calling him back. He was happy because Himari always made an effort to keep him company. He felt comfortable by her side. But compared to the charismatic Himari, he was nothing after all, and in the end, things turned out that way. He returned home after work where he found the house in complete disarray, asking his mother if she had eaten, but got no response. Riku continued saying he brought food from work and she could help herself, leaving the items on the table. And then he started cleaning the place, throwing the empty drink cans in the trash, thinking he should work even harder than before. When he finished, he sat down and lay back with a long sigh. He wished his father were there, things would be a little less bad. It was all very exhausting, but the days always went on like that, and during another day, Himari finally found him again. She was worried because he had stopped showing up at school often, and she came closer to see if he had some free time. Riku said he'd gotten another work shift and needed to go straight there. Maybe they could talk later, but she insisted it had to be now. Even so, he refused because she was being ridiculous. They could leave the story discussion for later. He would earn less money if he ended up being late. He really couldn't do anything right now and just wanted to leave. Still, Himari insisted because it would only take a moment and asked for just 1 second of his time to hear her words. Despite her request, the protagonist could only say that she had no idea how hard life was for him. Just because she was always privileged enough and lived without major worries, still taking up his time all the time with stupid things. Himari was shocked by what she heard and tried to approach, but Riku just yelled at her to leave him alone for good. When he rode away on his bike, he ended up realizing he had crossed the line and had been rude to her. He had gone too far because he was very frustrated with himself. He knew he'd have to apologize the next day, but just the next day, he heard that she had transferred schools. Apparently, it was due to a family issue, and all happened very suddenly, and not even the other students at school understood what had happened. Himari left for somewhere not even Riku knew, and all that remained with him was the notebook of their story in World Raiders. That was the last draft they were able to work on. They had poured their hearts and souls into it, and Riku's writing had always been complimented by his editor's notes. That was when he noticed there was something at the end that he hadn't done himself, a drawing saying that the strongest princess and Dachi lived happily ever after. At that very moment, the protagonist began to cry when he realized it was something Himari herself had done, and he felt horrible, like a complete idiot. So Riku ran off knowing he had been selfish and only thought about himself, not even trying to hear what she wanted to say. He wanted to be able to apologize to his childhood friend, and that was why he was betting everything he had on this. A story they had worked on for so long. If it could become popular, maybe it could reach Himari somewhere in the world. That was because Riku had promised her that he would become a successful novelist for her, and he would definitely find her. Above all, he intended to confess his true feelings to her, and that was how Riku published his story on the internet. Still, his work shifts continued, and he went to work as usual, not understanding how things could remain disconnected after all that time. The next day, he was going to work as a security guard, but he still had some spare time and could go to a bookstore to read a little afterward. At the library, he was surprised when he saw several books that had fallen to the floor, but no one tried to pick them up, leaving it all to the staff. The protagonist was shocked that people really just left everything there, and he saw a girl bend down to collect the books. Even though it was the guy who had just left who knocked them over, he let others deal with the problem. Riku approached, asking politely to help the girl, and the girl thanked him, saying he was an angel for that. That was when the protagonist recognized that voice while the girl was relieved the books hadn't gotten dirty. Riku asked if she was Himari, and the girl looked at him and also recognized him immediately. It was at that moment that everyone found themselves in complete chaos as their phones received a flood of notifications. Suddenly, a large magic circle appeared above the building and everyone looked up, not understanding what was going on. Meanwhile, Riku was about to talk to his old childhood friend, but she looked away and he understood her reaction. After all, he was the one who had avoided her, but instead she just piled a bunch of books onto him and the stack only grew taller. Riku held the books, not understanding what was going on, until Himari laughed, saying it had been a while since they last saw each other. It was at that moment that several people inside the bookstore had their phones flooded with messages, all ringing at once. Even Himari saw her phone go off even though it was in silent mode, and she saw a magic circle appear, materializing in front of her face. Riku realized this felt a little familiar. It was like the opening of the novel he had written so many years ago. He shouted to his childhood friend, but then the magic circle disappeared from her screen, and she was still wondering what it was. Suddenly, the entire building trembled, and they looked around, not understanding anything, much less noticing the magic circle above them. People grew scared because it felt like a major earthquake was happening. The bookshelves toppled, and Riku guided Himari further away. They crouched down, worried, because it seemed like the tremor had stopped, but the protagonist was still lost in thought. First, all the phones rang at the same time, then magic circles began to materialize. It was very similar to what he had written himself, but no monsters had appeared, so it was different, which only made him wonder again what was happening. He also felt something strange and unusual. It was as if they were descending in an elevator while standing still inside a building. Suddenly, the protagonist heard a voice yelling that it wasn't good, and everyone decided to look out the window to see outside. That was because the building they were in began to sink suddenly, but not only that, even the ground and cars were being swallowed. People had their phones in hand, wondering what was happening, and soon everyone started running to escape. But of course, people shoved each other to get others out of the way. Even though they wanted to form a line, they were selfish and wanted to be the first to get out. Everyone fought and pushed to escape first. Himari grew worried, and Riku immediately decided they could leave once everyone else had gone. But then the power went out, and she let out a sharp scream. On the 4th floor, people wondered if the building could withstand the situation. On the 3rd floor, people saw something purple appearing and wondered what it was. It looked like it was condensed. On the 2nd floor, they were completely swallowed by that purple thing, even without knowing what it was. On the 1st floor, everyone wanted to run out quickly, worried about their own lives and desperately calling for help. People were terrified because everyone could die there. It was still shocking that such a catastrophe was happening so suddenly. Cell phones had no signal, and they were desperate to escape, until one person decided to blow everything up and force their way out. Another person held him back so he wouldn't smash the window by force, because if it broke, they might be poisoned by that purple thing they still didn't even know what it was. The building was still sinking, and Riku was used to seeing in the dark, so he wasn't having much difficulty understanding his surroundings. Himari quietly commented that she never thought they would see each other again after so many years apart. But in this kind of situation, it wasn't the best of all, and she smiled a little even though she was trembling with fear. Seeing that made him realize it was true. They were able to see each other again after so long apart and in that horrible situation. Therefore, Riku didn't want them to be separated again. He intended to get out of there alive alongside his childhood friend, no matter what it took. So he comforted Himari to let her know things would be okay. He knew the building inside and out because of his job. There was an emergency generator there, so it wouldn't break down so easily. Besides that, he might not be the most reliable person, but he was there with her now. Suddenly, the two lost the ground beneath their feet when the building shook again. For a moment, they thought they were floating, but the next they knew, they were just falling. There was a huge mess as people and objects floated around the space. Riku ran to embrace Himari and cushion her fall. This time, suddenly it felt like they were rising instead of falling, but somehow everything was upside down compared to before. He didn't even know how that could be possible. He checked if she was hurt after the fall, and she replied she was fine, just wanting to understand what had happened. Riku stood up and looked out at the horizon through the window, shocked and not understanding what he was witnessing. That was because the entire building had flipped upside down and ended up in a completely different place from the city where they had been. Not only that, but all the other buildings had disappeared and only their building had ended up in that spot. Then Himari mentioned that she started hearing something. When they looked behind, several people noticed it was something coming from the top. And it was getting closer, and suddenly something fell with such force that people were thrown away. Something had dropped from a great height, when one of the adults screamed after seeing something in front of him. When they saw it was just a person, but then the person dropped and they noticed it wasn't a person, but just a piece of one. They saw something emerging from behind the person, and the creature immediately grabbed the first person it saw in front of it. Riku looked on in shock, not believing it was even possible, because it was the demon from his novel that had suddenly appeared in front of him. It was the four-armed executioner, Quadro, who immediately grabbed one of the humans, who was screaming in despair. Even though he begged it to stop, the demon didn't care at all and began ending the lives of everyone around him without any mercy. It was going after other people who were running desperately. Riku and Himari hid to avoid getting caught in the chaos. He thought that thing was a familiar creature, and his childhood friend asked if he actually recognized it. The protagonist agreed it was the same monster they had created in their novel, and she was surprised because he was talking about the novel they made back in high school. Quadro was a mid-level boss creature from the tower, highly skilled in using weapons like axes, capable of commanding goblins and stored gemstones. Because he had a terrifying gaze, even lesser monsters feared him. They moved in groups and had many other details described in the World Raider's notebook. Normal weapons couldn't hurt him. If attacked, he would chase his target to the end, but he was a very slow monster despite his lethality. If the world was following their novel faithfully, there should be mages and goblins appearing now too. The mages used magic linked to a magic crystal. They had no other form of attack, so they weren't a problem as long as one remained still the entire time. The goblins had big noses and sharp ears, so they could be called scouts. They also had the task of collecting any crystals around them. People were crystallized and became preserved food for the monsters, their energy being absorbed until their death. Himari believed it should only exist in the world of the book, and the protagonist agreed because he could hardly believe it either. After all, this was reality and he was seeing it happen before his eyes, with all the people screaming for them to run. Some people even tried to attack the monster, but that only enraged it, and they ended up being attacked in return, unable to do anything back. It charged at them without caring about anything else. None of them were a match for that monster. Maybe one of them thought they wouldn't be noticed if they pretended to be dead. That's what someone thought, but then another being appeared, accompanied by goblins right beside him. The being pointed at the man pretending to be dead, and the goblins immediately rushed at him. But before that could happen, a purple ray hit one of the goblins and turned it into crystal, and the man who was running away could only beg for it to stop. Even so, the mage's purple ray hit him directly, and just like the goblin, the man turned into crystal. Another goblin gathered the crystals made from people and other monsters into a bag to store them safely. One of them was even swallowed directly. Riku then suggested that they should get out of there. He would guide Himari out. But before they could move, a mage saw them, and the protagonist shouted for her to run and not stop moving. The two started running while the goblins saw them as new targets, including Quadro, who had taken care of all the other people around. They couldn't do anything against him yet, so they just had to run and value their lives above all else. Still, they didn't know where to go under those circumstances, and soon Riku saw a hallway and pointed to it. The protagonist let her go ahead of him, especially since Riku stumbled in the middle of the run. Quadro charged at him, and Riku spun just in time to avoid a fatal strike, but before he could be attacked again, a mug hit the monster's head. It was Himari who would try to draw the monster's attention to herself and save the protagonist's life. Now Quadro rushed to her immediately. They had to get out of there safely together, and Riku ran after them. He wouldn't let the monster do anything to her. He grabbed Himari's hand and pulled her so they could run away, thanking her for saving his life. The two ran toward a door, and Himari asked what they should do now, to which Riku pulled out a security card. They should use it on the upper panel. Riku supported Himari so she could climb and swipe the card, assuring her they'd be fine as long as she stayed calm. Even nervously, she made the effort and managed to swipe the security card to open the door, and Riku pushed her to go through first. She worried about him because Quadro's attack was coming right behind him with his sword ready to kill him. Himari pulled Riku. and they narrowly avoided another strike, hurrying so they could get inside before something worse happened. The two exited the room still being chased, but Guadro ended up stuck in the doorway because he was too large to pass through. It was their chance to escape, and Riku said they should take advantage of it to run downstairs. But Himari pointed out that it was impossible to go further down since the building was upside down. At that point, the two ended up trapped inside between a staircase and a monster trying to squeeze through to get to them. For the protagonist, it was clear that Guadro was targeting Himari all along, and he quickly grabbed her hand to escape through the duct and get out. They ran out and descended as far as the stairs allowed. On the next floor, there was no one there, but it was clear that a monster had passed through as well. Himari asked if they shouldn't have gone down further, and Riku replied that if they did that, especially in greater danger, they could end up hurt, so it was better to avoid it. If everything was just like he had written in his novel, then he had an idea of what he could do. Since the monster went after his friend, it would eventually stop on that floor. They might have a chance to defeat it right there on that floor, and Himari was impressed because he intended to fight it. Riku said that even if they didn't defeat it, they might have a chance to stop it if they used a few items. She was confused because they would be using just perfume and a tray for that. Guadro could only be defeated with magic or by using his own sword against him. Or if they used his own sword against him, he had seen a mage's magic reflected by a mirror a little earlier during the chaos on the other floor. The goblin in question was hit by the reflected magic and was crystallized, which meant that spells could be bounced back through the mirror. That's why they could hit Guadro with that magic using the mirror in their hands, so he began explaining the plan. They would start by luring Guadro to an open area where it would be easy to reflect the magic back at him. One of them would pretend to be dead and wait for a mage to arrive. They would be attacked by the mage and use the mirror to reflect the magic toward Guadro. Himari asked what would happen if she was the one pretending to be dead and Guadro came to her first and killed her. Riku said that in the novel, he was slow and his movements were much simpler. If she could run and hide, she'd be able to escape him easily. In that case, she offered to distract Guadro, but he couldn't allow her to do something that dangerous. It was out of the question. He asked her to stay safe behind the door even as Himari protested because Riku was still bleeding from the earlier attack. She came closer and helped stop the bleeding, apologizing, but now the only remaining option was to be the bait. And she would be that bait. If anything happened, she could flee and leave him, but Riku immediately refused that completely. After all, he didn't want to lose his childhood friend again, and Himari blushed a little when she heard those words. He started to talk about how he had been so rude back then, but he was interrupted by the arrival of monsters. They were coming up the escalator. He told her to head toward the door, and Himari agreed, leaving everything in Riku's hands and hoping everything would work out. Several goblins came running toward him to attack, and the protagonist threw the perfume far away. The goblins had a strong sense of smell and couldn't stand strong odors, so he threw it toward them, hoping it would work. As the goblins twisted in pain from the perfume's smell, the other monster also appeared, running toward them. Riku shouted for Guadro to come toward him, and the protagonist ran, hoping the mage would appear, and he showed up just a little later. He barely avoided another attack from the monster and ran to reach the mage in time. Himari watched everything and realized that Riku was right. They weren't exclusively targeting her. Now he just had to hide somewhere safe, and the protagonist himself felt he had to keep up his pace. However, he ended up being struck by a slash from the sword that was thrown at him while he was running. And immediately, Himari screamed when she saw him fall to the ground. Riku felt like his plan had failed. At this rate, he would end up dying. Then Himari shouted to draw Guadro's attention toward herself this time and called out to buy time and save Riku's life. The monster ran toward her immediately while the mage shot magic at the protagonist. Guadro charged in to pierce the girl. That was when the magic was reflected in the mirror and hit the monster before that could happen. Even injured, Riku managed to make the plan work, and in that instant, Guadro turned into crystal. Himari fell seated in relief after being saved at the last second. They had finally managed to take him down, and Riku came closer to check if she was safe. But she was the one who wanted to ask that since he had been hit, and she asked if he was okay. Riku could still move enough not to be targeted by the mage, so he was fine. It was all thanks to the perfume bottle on the ground, but Riku ended up collapsing after a while, which drew the mage's attention and made her worried. The two ended up laughing a little, and the protagonist realized he had always wanted the chance to apologize to her. That was how Riku decided to apologize now, because he had acted as if she hadn't even existed in the past. He had always wanted to say that to her before. And Himari herself apologized too, but before they could say more, suddenly Guadro's crystal shattered and he burst out of the magic using sheer force. They were both caught by surprise, unable to believe the monster managed to do such a thing. Not even that magic worked. Now he was furious. Riku saw that crystallizing him didn't help, and now he himself had become the monster's new target. Himari screamed in concern, but the protagonist told her not to move because he would draw the monster's attention. Then the girl saw the monster's sword on the floor and remembered how Riku had always saved her in every situation. Both in the past and in the present, she remembered when people told a girl like her to play with dolls instead of a sword. The truth was that she had always loved adventure, even though Himari had heard from her mother that she could have anything she wanted for her birthday. Her mother still thought a doll would be much better, and that she should just keep it. She was a girl, after all. And in that way, everyone dictated what she should do or how she should feel through common sense, until Riku suggested that they could create a story. It could be a story with a superhero princess, and the protagonist invited Himari to write it alongside him and another boy who was with them at the time. Riku said she could be whoever she wanted inside the story. He was the first person who truly recognized her completely, and she agreed even while crying, which meant a lot to her. That's why Himari always wanted to repay him for everything. She drew at the end of her story notebook, declaring to herself that she was the strongest princess of all. So Himari picked up Guadro's sword while she saw him charging toward Riku, who was running for his life. He saw a lot of blood on the ground and realized it had to be his, and because of that, he ended up tripping and falling after losing so much blood. He hit something and wondered if it was a wall because he could barely move or even see in those conditions. In fact, Riku realized it was just the floor he had collapsed onto. He was running out of strength to escape, but he had to keep moving. He needed to survive so that he could grow stronger alongside Himari above all else. Guadro raised his sword to strike Riku, but then stopped and missed his swing. Riku saw Himari using the sword to attack the monster. She drew the monster's attention because now she was its opponent, even as Riku screamed for her to run, she refused. That was because Himari didn't intend to leave him there. That wasn't an option now, not after they had finally reunited after so long. Himari's sword flew from her hand when she was struck by the attack, and then she was grabbed and lifted into the air. Riku ran to make the monster stop. He couldn't let her die, so he rushed to grab the sword and fight. He shouted for Guadro to let her go because he was its creator. Should obey his orders above all. Himari was happy because she had been able to see him one last time, and she smiled in her final moments while Riku could only watch her die in front of him. Riku felt his eyes filling with tears and charged at the monster with the sword, full of rage and asking why something like this had happened. He used his sword to attack Guadro in the middle of his anger, but ended up falling because he was wounded and bleeding. His strength was also fading. He questioned why. After they had finally reunited, he couldn't understand how things ended up like that. Riku narrowly avoided another attack, still struggling, and rolled against a window that shattered. Still wondering why something like this had to happen after all. Himari was the one who died, not him. He would have preferred it had been him instead. The mage approached Himari's body, with Riku still begging for them to stop. He didn't want to see them do anything to her. Despite his screams, the mage still used his magic to turn her into crystal, leaving Riku in a state of shock. It was the end of the road. He couldn't even move. Even after they had reunited again, that was the result. Things were going to end there. Despite that, Riku couldn't give up now, and he grabbed the sword to defend himself and attack Guadro. He used the blade of the sword to reflect the mage's magic back at the monster. This was his world, so it should obey its creator. Thus, Riku used the sword to kill a monster with his own hands, and the monster's body fell from the great height of the building through the window. Spitting blood, the protagonist stood up. He needed to at least retrieve Himari's body, even if it was in crystal form. He ran to grab the crystal, but didn't reach it in time because Guadro's body pulled him by his clothes to fall with him. Riku didn't even understand what was happening until he began to fall, plunging from the great height into that strange purple water. And he asked himself why things had ended up that way, even when he had been so close to everything ending well. If this really was the same world Riku knew, then it demanded his power so that he could save Himari. Even if it cost him everything he had to gain power to make that possible. That was when a classic system screen appeared asking if he was sure, and Riku shouted that he would do anything to save Himari. And so the system congratulated him. He had acquired a master-level skill called Decipher, but Riku himself hadn't fully understood what had happened. The towers that Daichi had been searching for in the original story were scattered across the entire world. If they were organized by numbers, things would go more smoothly. He had shown Himari at the time all the details of his story, and she agreed that all the details really were very well done. Their main plot was that demons tormented every part of this world, but they would start with Japan first. The towers, or demonic citadels, would be divided into large, medium, and small sizes. The more urban the area, the more towers there would be there. The characters were currently conquering medium and small-sized towers, and Himari suggested having all the bosses from the large towers appear at once. When the medium and small towers were defeated, there would end up being too many of them, and Riku opposed that idea. Instead, he suggested the protagonist would have to collect all the keys from the medium tower bosses. Himari agreed. It sounded like a cool idea. It was like a treasure hunt. Daichi's strength level would be represented by his base level, and she asked if there was anything else she could add. She commented that a leveling system would be very good. He also thought that would be fitting, and the two agreed on that. More elements meant more fun. She thought they could also add sites with magical effects. Riku suggested adding scrolls too, containing single-use sealed spells. Himari agreed with the idea, and he smiled, thanking her for being there. She always knew so many details about games. Being praised for knowing so much about games was something she would never get used to, and Riku blushed, feeling that he'd always seen that quality in her because she was so good at it. That was when he noticed she had disappeared, and he stood up wondering where she had suddenly gone. He heard someone calling Riku, and he saw her again, this time as an adult, no longer a student, after all that time. And he ran toward her because he had been searching for her. They had finally reunited after so long. Begging her not to leave him, he didn't want to lose Himari a second time, 2 times in a row like that. That was when Riku sank, unable to reach her while running, and he remembered also seeing his system asking if he was really okay with that. When he woke up, Riku was reaching his hand toward the ceiling and sat up suddenly, still calling for Himari, startling the nurse beside him. Riku asked where he was, and the nurse quickly called the doctor because he had finally awakened after so long. He got out of bed to look out the window, wondering if it had all just been a huge delusion in his head or some crazy dream. Then he came upon an unbelievable scene. the city full of adventurer screens and advertisements. There were promotions for people to become adventurers and get their insurance. They were recruiting new members. He could only stare at it all without understanding anything, wondering what all of that suddenly was. It seemed like nothing that happened with Himari had been a dream. That was when someone approached, saying they couldn't believe he had finally woken up after 10 years in a coma. It was the doctor who came closer to say that patients needed physical therapy because their muscles had become weak. She was dying to dissect his body the moment she saw him, and Riku turned in fright when he saw the woman who introduced herself as Kagami, the attending physician. Kagami knew he must be surprised because many things had changed in the world since some time ago. She praised him for having endured so much. Starting now, he should call this new reality the new normal. That was because their reality had been merged with another world, and that was where they had found Riku some time ago. New rules had been established, as well as guilds created for the purpose of killing the monsters that attack people. And because it was also profitable, companies and businessmen were competing in this field. The protagonist asked if the monsters didn't come into their world. If that was the case, there was no need for people to risk themselves going to the other world where so many problems existed. The doctor said that for some reason, the monsters didn't cross over into their world, but the reason people went to the other side was simple. Simply because they wanted to save more humans who were lost on the other side in the other world. One day, several skyscrapers disappeared at the same time all around the world. They called that date the inverted day. People are still searching for those who were caught in the debris or disappeared due to the incident. Riku reflected on what he had just heard because all of that happening at the same time across the entire world was just like in his novel. The survivors, like himself, were found alive after the incident. Others were also saved, but in a crystallized state. Or rather, there were many types of people being kept protected, and Riku asks if there really were survivors. He wanted to know if there was a girl named Himari as well. She was severely injured and later became a crystal. Kagami remained silent before saying that she couldn't answer that with certainty yet. Still, she suggests he could see with his own eyes and guides him through the hallways, explaining that this was a government hospital near where he had been found. Therefore, most of the survivors were also there, and the administration earned a lot of money through subsidiaries. And people like Kagami too, enthusiasts who love having subjects for their research. Riku doesn't even wonder if she has permission to say all this to a patient. Even so, if Himari was indeed kept while crystallized, she could still be there, and the doctor guides him to the location in question. It didn't take long for the protagonist to see a girl he believed to be Himari, and he ran to her to check if she was okay. Then Riku noticed it wasn't the girl he was looking for, and the doctor approaches saying that all the crystallized individuals found were brought to that room, and they were transported into capsules. They returned to normal after spending some time in this world, but were only kept there for precaution and safety. They also conducted a thorough examination of their bodies during awakening and discovered that their wounds could gradually heal if crystallized before dying. Kagami wondered what the purpose of this was, and Riku replies it was to preserve their food, which piqued her interest. It seemed that he also knew the novel World Raiders and must have read it online. Riku agrees, even if he feels his story has become widespread. But under certain circumstances, they turned into mummies after having all their nutrients sucked out or something like that, apparently. But the point was that they hadn't found any crystal with signs of having been consumed. Even after 2 years, there's a possibility that everyone is alive and well. If he wanted to look for someone else, the doctor advised doing so at the reception downstairs. As they walked, she asked where his family was, and Riku replied that everything was fine. His mother lived on her own at home after remarrying. He would personally call her to inform her of what had happened, and Kagami agreed, leading him to where the phone was. All the information about the victims of the inverted day was being stored in the database. Everything was updated with the latest whereabouts as well. Kagami allowed Riku to take his own time to deal with the situation, and he thanked her before searching for the name Himari Hinamoto. The doctor had previously said there were other hospitals similar to that one, so even if she wasn't there, there was still a small possibility. Even after searching, Riku saw that there was no data about her, and he grew frustrated because he believed he had lost the chance. Himari could still be somewhere around, but he remembers the things the doctor said about people returning to normal in that world after some time. If everything happened as the doctor said, he could still save Himari as long as he found her crystal. He couldn't lose hope. Riku was going to save her wherever she was, but how, when, and with whom were questions he still didn't know how to answer. Suddenly, he hears a shout asking if he was having trouble finding a group, and the protagonist saw a commercial on the television. The commercial's mascot, Akon, explains that everything could be safe, reliable, and reputable on the ARK2 website. They could receive support 24 hours a day from their veterans, even if they were complete novices. Security could be guaranteed even under the most unexpected circumstances. They could join and become adventurers with them. They could see more information on the ARK2 website, and Riku saw that the catchy commercial could actually be convincing. They were now live in front of the prosperous company known as ARK2, and the reporter said this was a company created to change the way society thinks. All of this had happened since the inverted day, and the CEO of the company was none other than the novelist behind the prophetic novel, the author of World Raiders. Riku froze upon hearing this. After all, the novel was his, and he was the one who had written it, without understanding how that had happened. He had left the story's notes inside a cabinet at a cyber cafe, so it could have been quite easy for someone to take possession of them. If they had identified the computer where he made the post and hacked the account, it must have been easy to identify the author. But now they had stolen his novel, or rather his and Himari's novel that they had spent so much time working on. That really infuriated him, and that's when he heard the same commercial again about the company Era K2. Riku gets sulky because the company claimed they were the first to create the current guild system based on the prophecies of the book. Accidentally, if you switch the first letters of each word in the original novel's title, you get Ardu or Reverse World, as determined by the CEO. That was the Reverse Tower Dungeon, and the reporter learned that the buildings had become strange, floating in the air with the top and bottom turned upside down. It seemed that the same name was given to the buildings, not to mention that right after the inverted day, the CEO personally took control of everything. To conquer the first towers, they managed to save many lives thanks to that man's actions. The CEO used knowledge from the novel to gain the upper hand against the monsters. Unfortunately, they couldn't show him on TV. He was hailed as a mysterious figure, but viewers were encouraged to stay tuned to Era K2's future ventures. While Riku was watching the television, Kagami was making a call to report his awakening after some time. Their special patient had woken up, and at the same time, a car sped off during the call, saying to handle things professionally. That was still a hospital, so they trusted that no other damage would occur if they did things properly. Besides, he was still part of the government, so he expected Kagami to keep the matter between them and confidential. The man on the call, the CDO of the company, expected and appreciated their cooperation, and then the car braked hard to secure the back doors. At the same moment, a large group of men in suits entered the hospital. Even Riku was somewhat surprised. They pointed and said to search for the target from the ground floor upward, and a nurse approached to ask who they were. The men replied that they were looking for a patient and that they had a warrant from the council president for it. They wanted Riku to be handed over, and he took the opportunity to hide, now aware they were after him. The men ran off, even rudely pushing elderly people who were in their way without any manners. Riku wondered who they thought they were to run around a hospital acting so arrogantly. He guessed he'd be in trouble if found, so the best thing to do now was to return to his room on the second floor. So he walked off, but then heard voices shouting because they hadn't found the target in his room and wondered where he had gone this time. They blocked all possible exits, and Riku continued hiding from the men who were walking back and forth. He knew, as expected, they were all watching his hospital room, and he'd probably have to leave his belongings there for now. When he turned around, suddenly he saw an arm appear in front of him and 3 security guards gathered to talk. The first and second floors had been searched, and now they were moving on to the third, all exits blocked, but he should still be there somewhere. They pointed to the laundry room door and said they had tried, but the door was locked. They couldn't enter without a staff member's key. He shouldn't be in there anyway, and so they continued their search for Riku, who should still be somewhere in the hospital. Meanwhile, little did they know that Riku was hiding with the doctor inside the closet, holding her after narrowly escaping the men. He thanks Kagami, who smiles back at him, saying it was her duty to keep her patients safe, although Riku was still a bit embarrassed about the situation. Kagami says those men were dangerous, and he should stay in that room for now, but the protagonist refuses, because he had to leave immediately. Besides, they were after him. If he stayed, he'd only cause problems for everyone in the hospital. That makes the doctor smile, as things had gone just as she expected, and then Kagami hands him several clothes to take. If he had made up his mind, she wouldn't stop him, and she would cover the cost. Riku thanks her while putting on the disguised clothes. She also hands him his prescription, telling him he could read it once he was outside. Riku was confused when he heard that. Instead of explaining, Kagami just supported him in leaving the hospital because he could see things with his own eyes. And she simply pushes him down the laundry chute, congratulating him for being officially discharged. Riku fell from that height in disbelief, landing in a pile of clothes, not believing a doctor would actually do that to him. But when he looked at the paper he received, there was a map drawn on it and a big good luck marked with lipstick. It was a map to the border, which made him feel relieved, so Riku ran off to escape the situation. Kagami just watched his surreal recovery, seeing that he was already running even though he had just left the hospital. She wished she had had the chance to dissect him, but it was a shame that opportunity had passed her by. Still, she knew they could meet again some other day, and so Riku continued on his path, until he arrived at a large building where he heard a voice saying that those who wanted to go up the elevator to enter the inverted city should follow the line. Going to the inverted city was dangerous, but Riku knew that if he entered, he could reach the other side, to the world where Himari was, and he could go after her again. Eventually the gates were opened. Everyone would be checked through facial recognition, so they had to remove their hats or masks. People around asked why they needed to be checked, and another replied that it was because of the boarding passes. That way, criminals and illegal passengers couldn't pass through. There was also an age and capacity limit. Therefore, it was necessary to schedule in advance, which made the protagonist tense because he didn't have a card, but the doctor's map had led him there. Even though he was worried, Riku put his trust in the doctor as the camera scanned his face, confirming his passage. And so they allowed him through without cutting the line, and the protagonist celebrated internally, thanking the doctor. As described in legal notice number 247, any problem that occurred during the trip would be outside jurisdiction. For that reason, they had to place their belongings in front of them and press their safety 5, and Riku entered thinking it looked a bit like an amusement park. On the television, a woman explained to the passengers and welcomed them, saying they were on the metaverse elevator to the inverted world. They would be taking off shortly, and Riku was shocked because the seats began to move. It really did feel like an amusement park ride. Soon they would begin to descend, so they should brace for impact, and the protagonist was confused since it was supposed to be an elevator. And suddenly the entire place shook when they landed, and Riku was shocked because they were really submerged. They were approaching a point of severe turbulence, so the voice told everyone to hold on tight. Then the protagonist realized they were going through the same thing as last time when he fell from the building with Himari. They rotated the seat to compensate for the turning of the world to reach the other side, and it was crazy enough to make Riku feel tense. Now they were rising again, and they would soon be arriving, and he wondered if many things had changed since then. 2 years had passed since he had gone to the other world, and soon it was announced that they had arrived, and they were asked to check their belongings before disembarking. Without further ado, the assistant welcomed them to the inverted world, and now Riku could see the light outside as they asked everyone to remain safe. Getting off the elevator, Riku was impressed because outside there was a large city full of people. In just 2 years since the inverted day, that place had become so amazing that humanity could live like that. On the other hand, no one had yet conquered the towers despite the incredible city. Even after 2 long years, the place was still full of monsters. To all newcomers, a man announced that skill evaluations and bracelets were being distributed right there. Those who had not yet been evaluated would not be qualified to join a guild, so everyone needed to do that first. During the evaluations, a woman approached the people so they could begin, and she offered a cup of juice for them to drink first. Riku, along with others, drank the suspiciously colored juice without knowing what it was, and she said it was actually monster bodily fluids. Immediately, they all spit out the drink and shouted because they had been tricked in such a cruel way. The woman smiled, saying that they offered the fluids to drink so they could experience it as if they had defeated the monsters themselves. And if they gained even a few experience points, it was because of that, and their unique structure, as well as their abilities, would be revealed to them. They wouldn't do any harm. But Riku still thought it was disgusting, just like everyone else around who had drunk that goo. At any moment, they would see the change, and the protagonist saw a system screen appear right in front of him. Something appeared congratulating Riku, and he remembered it was similar to what happened the previous time. Some others commented that it looked like game windows that could even touch around the screen, but each one could only see their own screen. The girl notices that they could now see the interfaces of their windows and could close them whenever they wanted. Since it was an evaluation institute, she would avoid giving any detailed explanation about them, and they were a bit surprised by how careless she was. In a little while, their abilities would appear in the window, but first they needed to be evaluated and receive a bracelet according to their class. She asked them not to remove their bracelets because they served as tags to identify each of them. They were almost at the fun part, as she would use the item and skill scanner and asked everyone to line up for their skill evaluation. Riku wondered if the thing she was holding was a thermometer, and one of them asked what it was. Another man said it was a skill-made item. Apparently, there was a craftsman who made those things, and they could be used for evaluations. The woman scanned the first man and said his ability was growth, offering him a blue bracelet. As soon as they received a bracelet, she asked them to send their guild application forms right away. Riku's ability window said his ability was of master level. Maybe it was something very strong and useful. He was excited and stepped forward for the scan, and the woman said he would receive a white bracelet and had the ability of deciphering. Continuing on his way, the protagonist eventually arrived at the Adventurer Guild. That would be where his adventure began. But when he went to talk to the receptionist inside the guild, the first thing he heard was that his ability was a huge piece of trash, and he wouldn't be able to get into any group with that ability, and Riku was caught off guard, asking what he meant by that. In response, the receptionist sighed, surprised that he truly didn't know anything about the adventurer world. The truth was that no one would accept him into a group with an unknown ability. It was common sense that people chose who to accept based on ability popularity. And since he got the worst of all the abilities in all 3 categories, it was clear that it was nothing but garbage. Riku hesitated before asking why, and the receptionist asked again if he had even tried researching before coming there. F was for physical, M for magic, and U for unique. 2 of those categories prepared someone for battle. In other words, they were basic fundamentals. And therefore, he should understand why. These were abilities that either increased physical capabilities or allowed magic casting. Neither would let you down. Riku understood because it made some sense, and unique was the term used for abilities that were neither magical nor physical. That was his first warning, but some unique abilities could be attached to the other 2 under certain conditions. Crafting might be a low-level ability, for example, but it gave the power to create anything like armor or weapons. Those with that ability were valuable and could become useful. Deciphering, on the other hand, was a low-level ability. Therefore, it would be the most useless among all unique abilities. If he wanted to know why, he could find out for himself. And that was his second warning. Riku kept saying it was a master-level ability, but even so, the receptionist stated that abilities like that didn't exist. He could check right there by the color of his bracelet. His was white, which meant it was a weak bearer ability, not even a proper ability to begin with. That was his third warning, so the receptionist said he should now better understand his situation. No one would be stupid enough to accept him into a group, especially after receiving 3 warnings in a row without catching on. Therefore, it was clear he had no luck at all. He should just give up. If it were him, he'd go back to the real world and forget about the guild. Even so, Riku still wanted to register, which made the man shout at him as if he were deaf. If he stepped inside, he'd end up dead. But the protagonist insisted because he knew he just had to survive by using his ability in some other way that would be useful. He was used to that kind of thing, which made the receptionist sigh. He wouldn't be to blame if something happened along the way. When his request was finally approved, he left, thanking the receptionist for his attention. Meanwhile, the man reflected that another reckless guy had appeared the same way before Riku. He really wasn't the only one. The protagonist's next step was to earn money. Maybe he could take his time washing dishes or doing similar things. As he was walking, he suddenly heard a voice yelling and asking what the hell was wrong with that kid. A lower class white bracelet like his shouldn't be challenging those of higher class. In front of the 2 higher class men, the lower class one replied that it wasn't about classes, it was about cutting in line. At that moment, Riku stepped in, asking them to wait. After all, they were pressuring a poor child. The two men grew irritated as their actions were interrupted, but the protagonist continued saying they shouldn't mess with her. The girl was scared and even started to tremble, so adults shouldn't do those things to children. That's when Riku was suddenly knocked down by the child behind him, who was annoyed and said she didn't need to be defended. As the protagonist hit the ground without understanding what had just happened, he saw the girl removing her hat to show her face. She complained because he kept saying she was short, even though she, Chiza, wasn't short at all. They themselves were surprised because that was a girl, and Chiza said none of that could be more irrelevant. She was just asking him to apologize because he had cut in line, that was all, while she had been in line first. Not having seen her because of her height was just another lame excuse after everything. At that moment, Riku grabbed her foot, asking if she didn't want to say anything to him before going back to arguing with them. Hearing that, she grumbled that he was no different from those other idiots, and that he made her sick. The protagonist argued with the girl because she was being pretty mean even though he showed up trying to help her. But Chiza complained that she hadn't asked for anything until the other two men who had just been watching realized that both of them had white bracelets. And they mocked them, saying two white bracelet losers had just met. Maybe they could even form a group. Chiza got angry at their tone, saying they hadn't even finished talking yet before being dismissed like that. When the men left, Riku approached and apologized for calling the girl what he did earlier. He might not know her yet, but it didn't change the fact that he had hurt her feelings and ended up upsetting her. After saying that, he intended to leave, but Chiza asked him to wait and grabbed his arm before he could go. Instead, she pointed for him to follow her, and Riku couldn't understand what kind of expression she was making. The girl introduced herself as Sakuraba Chiza, and she was one with a white bracelet and still unknown ability. He introduced himself to her as well while following her. He had just arrived in the city, so he didn't know many places. When he asked where they were going, Chiza replied that he could just think of it as an apology to him. The two went toward a huge building that froze the protagonist in place because of how fancy it looked. And Riku asked if they were about to pick up equipment before going to the tower, but she denied it, because they couldn't form a group unless there were 3 members in total, and Chiza asked what his ability was. He replied that it was deciphering, so scrolls should be better for him. He couldn't carry too many of them. Plus, they were probably compatible with his ability. Riku asked how he could use his ability, and Chiza answered that he could use it through the interface or just by saying its name with the intention to use it. So he could be arrested if he used an ability inside the city, and he was surprised to hear it was that simple. Chiza alone was shocked that he had never known that not even the skill evaluator had told him anything when he went to discover it. In fact, the protagonist could remember how blunt and brief that woman had been, so he really couldn't rely on her. Anyway, when he did just as Chiza said, he managed to see his ability just as expected. Riku decided he would use his ability later and asked what Chiza's was. She proudly answered that it was her charm. It was obvious that the protagonist looked at her in a somewhat doubtful way, which left Chiza a little annoyed. Anyway, she led him through the group of people so they could leave, and meanwhile they heard a voice asking if he still hadn't been found. Riku turned and realized it was the same group of men in black from the hospital. They had come all the way there just to look for him. It was better to go inside and let them pass, and Chiza noticed that and pulled him toward where they should enter. Commoners like them could only shop in closed places like that. That was Diagonal Alley, which surprised him because it was just a street next to the big fancy sales building. At least he could kill some time and stay away from the men in black, but everything in that place felt shady, including the food. Chiza agreed it was chaotic, but she liked it there. It had the kind of vibe that told you to survive no matter what. The quality of the items might be lower than those in other shops, but they were all well selected. Everything one could need for an adventure could be found there. You could also haggle quite a bit, but the sellers might also try to scam you in the meantime. It would all depend entirely on your judgment. Chiza was warning the protagonist to be very careful with such things. Decipher was a low-level ability, and Riku had heard it was also the most useless among the unique abilities. His ability was called Decipher. This world was supposed to be based on his novel, but he still didn't know if it was random or just an ability he didn't understand yet. Maybe it could be used to evaluate items or something like that. Riku would still have to try it out to discover how much his ability could evolve over time. And he acknowledged how much Chiza knew about that world, asking how long she had been there. The girl dodged the question, saying that shouldn't matter that much, and besides, Riku was actually the most lost one there. Soon, it finally arrived at the scroll shop. Riku was surprised that such a shop existed behind such a fancy mansion. When he approached to check out the scrolls, he asked how he could use them, and Chiza sighed because he was a hopeless case. Scrolls contain sealed magic. Each scroll sealed a different type of magic, and it was a one-time use item. Normally, you couldn't use abilities outside your category. Even if you used a fire magic scroll, you still couldn't cast magic on your own. But that was exactly what scrolls were made for. Since you couldn't obtain scrolls right away, it was necessary to go to shops like this to get them analyzed. Then you could sell the ones you didn't want or need. Riku could understand, as in the end, some items were still similar to those in the original novel. While he looked at the available items, Chiza came closer to warn him that that one was for blue bracelets. They couldn't use those. Prices varied according to the bracelet class, but they could draw theirs in the cheaper sections like the white bracelet lottery. Chiza said they could think of it like a roulette. You wouldn't know what you'd get until you spun it, and sometimes you might even get something good. Now the protagonist could understand that this had been her apology gift to him, although it was a bit unique. While looking at the scrolls, Riku spotted one in particular that caught his attention, and the shop owner approached, greeting them both. But then he noticed that he had never seen him around and knew right away he was an easy target just by looking at him. He would never get anything useful out of that box. After all, he was a decipherer of blue bracelet class. He had deciphered all the scrolls inside that box, but after a while, Riku picked a rather worn-out scroll from the back of the box. Chiza was somewhat surprised, and the man smiled. That piece of junk was so worn out that even he couldn't decipher it. After deciding to buy it, Riku chose to keep the scroll even though he hadn't been able to read it beforehand. but he thought it was rare considering it had been floating in Mauve Lake, and he entered it in the lottery anyway. The girl asked Riku if he was really going to keep that piece of junk, especially since she would be the one paying for it. The protagonist replied that he saw it first, so it would be his, and since he insisted so much, she had no choice but to buy it. Chisa scanned her bracelet on the vendors, who received the 3,000 yen, reminding them that he didn't offer refunds no matter what they had picked. Riku was curious because he never knew that bracelets were also used for payments like that. The girl looked at her bracelet, noticing her balance was low, and she got to recharge. It was just common sense. The two left the shop while the protagonist asked her how to use the scroll. She replied that he just had to open the scroll and say the name of the ability inside it to make it work. However, when he opened it, Chisa was caught by surprise because it was blank and immediately went to argue with vendor because the scroll had nothing inside. But the man laughed because she had paid for it, and besides, she should have seen that they guaranteed there were no blank scrolls. So a white bracelet rookie acting like a veteran still fell for that scam, which only made her even more furious. That was the lottery. You could win or lose. It wasn't his fault they got tricked if they ended up picking something bad. No one liked or needed those anyway, and he told them to just go back to the real world right now. Chisa had a bad feeling from the beginning. Even with little money to spend, they still bought that thing only to get nothing in return. The girl lowered her head with tears of frustration, so Riku interrupted, mentioning that it actually hadn't been for nothing. The vendor questioned what he was talking about. No matter how much he looked, it was clear there was nothing of value there. The protagonist claimed he could see the potential inside it, even though it looked blank at first glance. He activated his master-level decipherability, removing all types of encryption or sealing. The mana required to use it was high. When he showed the open scroll, the vendor was surprised by a sudden light that appeared on the paper. The scroll was transforming as Riku used his ability, and it stated that it was an indecipherable scroll due to its worn-out state. However, once released, it could be seen that it was a master-level scroll. Permanent acquisition of the inscribed ability was successfully completed. The other two froze in shock from the new information. It was a master-level scroll with fire explosion. The vendor froze in surprise, saying he had never heard of a permanent acquisition like that before. That scroll had been glowing inside unlike the others. Surely it was because the vendor's ability was too weak to notice something so obvious. The accusation made the man angry, but he said Riku must be a decipherer like him. Eki had a white bracelet, as you could clearly see. The man laughed, saying he had known all along and was just messing with them since they were all rookies. He wanted to teach them that scammers existed around there. He claimed to have accidentally put the scroll in the box, and now he wanted it back, or else he'd report them for theft. After all, Riku hadn't used the scroll yet, which meant the ability was still inside and could be used. He could get rich if he got it back. That was one of the scrolls he was selling. But Chisa knew that if it was opened, a spell could be cast. If the protagonist were hit at point-blank range, he could be seriously injured, and she grew serious as she watched the scene. While the man insisted on getting it back, Chisa opened her coat, thinking she had never wanted to use it, but now it was necessary. She pulled out a weapon, thinking it wouldn't be a problem if used only briefly, pointed it at the man, and reminded him that he didn't offer refunds. Riku froze in surprise when he saw what she was doing, and the man looked at her weapon. It had a flower and a skull mark. That was a special weapon, one he recognized, but Chisa ordered Riku not to just stand there. He should hurry and claim the ability. He agreed and did just as she said. The permanent acquisition of the ability gave him a fire magic skill. There was a fire explosion embedded in a white bracelet. The white fire explosion he could now use. Fire explosion was a spell that could summon fireballs. The mana needed for it was very low in comparison. Now Riku had two abilities, and as soon as he finished, Chisa put her weapon away since it was no longer needed. At that moment, the vendor took the chance to try to kill them both and take the items they were carrying, preparing to attack. Using Ice Frost with his white bracelet, he would fire sharp ice bullets at high speed. The mana needed was also quite low in comparison. He planned to attack Chisa first since she had threatened him. But before the attack could take effect, the protagonist prepared his fire magic. Using his fire explosion, he burned the man's ice, impressing Chisa, who collapsed to the ground and sighed in relief. Right away, the vendor became furious because not only the magic, but also the scrolls had been burned. He ran off after realizing he had lost everything, and Chisa shouted for him to at least wait a moment. At the same time, he yelled "thieves," which surprised the two of them. They had set fire to his magic shop, and he began to cry for help. Other people heard the shouts and noticed that magic had been used in the city. It was on fire, and they had to call the guards. Riku realized things were getting bad, and Chisa explained that they were like the police of that place. He wanted to explain everything to the guards about what had happened, but then noticed the men in black were among the crowd. They would end up finding him if he stayed there, so the two of them ran off, leaving everything behind without worrying about anything else. Chisa complained that this had been a horrible day and it was all Riku's fault. Even if he had saved her life, that was still the result. The protagonist asks what that weapon she drew was and if she always carried it with her. But the girl replies that it wasn't important right now. They had to get out of there. While they were fleeing, a man communicated with the others that they had found the prey they had been searching for. The guards surround all the city's routes, and they probably did the same with the other shops. Chisa says that if they couldn't leave, then only that end remained, and they point in the direction of the dungeon tower. She doubted they would expect two people with white bracelets to enter the tower. The guards hadn't gone in there yet. Chisa retorts that they still couldn't enter after all. They were missing a person in the group, and at least 3 were necessary. Suddenly, a person appeared approaching and asked if they were going to the tower now. It was 2 men who approached. One of them says they couldn't find another member for their guild, so they were looking for new people around. To them, it wouldn't matter what class it was, and he asks if the two of them would like to join them if they were interested. Riku thinks it would be a good opportunity, but wonders if people could really rely on others when they were out of luck in the guild. Besides, it was obvious those two were acting suspiciously, and he tells them they didn't have any equipment, so he was sorry for that. But then Chiza asks him to wait a moment, whispering to the protagonist that they would never get a chance like this again. People normally wouldn't team up with white bracelets, and besides, she had a special reason to go into the tower no matter what. Even so, she intended to accept the proposal even if it was on her own. The protagonist reflects on this and ends up understanding. They couldn't stay there any longer, and he couldn't leave her alone with those two clearly shady guys. If they kept running from danger back and forth, they would never reach anywhere in the end. After all, he also had to reach that tower as soon as possible to see if he could find him Mary there. Therefore, the protagonist agreed to the two men's proposal, which made one of them smile broadly, happy to hear it. They could lend them equipment there, and his friend would teach them every morning about the things they needed to know. The man welcomed them both. If it was their first time going up the tower, he could assume the same for the elevation. When Riku asked more about the elevation, the man named Matsukaze Shuchi, with a physical skill called growth, answered. He said it was a transport that connects them to the floating tower, and the other man named Umajawa Tepi, with a blue bracelet and water magic, complimented. He had heard that people used to use stairs and ropes before this was created. They would check their bracelets and the member count. Riku says they are novices, so he hoped they would go first, to which Tepi asked them to relax a little. He would make sure they arrived there safely, so the protagonist remained silent, just looking at the dungeon building. He thought it was his turn now and asks if Chiza was okay, to which she grumbles that yes, much better than him. And Riku ends up agreeing since he saw she had a weapon. In fact, Chiza says she shouldn't show that weapon to anyone else. Actually, it didn't even shoot. Anyway, that was making Chiza very anxious, and the protagonist mentions there was no need to get so worked up. They could take it easy for now as long as they didn't get killed. They could still manage within the circumstances. Hearing that left her a little moved after all, she remembered someone saying the same things to her in the past. Then Chiza agrees while turning her face. She didn't want to die yet unlike him, although Riku didn't understand if he said something that ended up cheering her up. So they start with the elevation, and the protagonist used it first. He had finally made it there. 2 years had passed since the incident, and he wonders if many things had changed inside. It didn't take long for him to reach that point. Meanwhile, the commander of the 4th Guard Squad, Kurumi Orika, heard from her men that they had managed to extinguish the fire and apologized for the commotion. Next to her, the scroll shop owner just watched, thinking that the rumors about the 4th Guard Squad's commander were indeed true. He heard that Orika was the dirtiest among all of them, but looking at her like that, she seemed more like a girl with her head in the clouds, but that didn't really matter. Orika says that several scrolls from the white bracelets that were inside the shop ended up being burned too. A master-level scroll ended up being stolen as a result, and the vendor agrees since it was a boy and a girl who did it. And he smiles, mentioning that they stole his license too, but Orika stares at him intensely because it seemed quite strange. As a blue bracelet decipherer like him, it was odd that he managed to decipher a scroll never seen before. She presses him, questioning if he was sure that was what happened, which made him fall backwards, backing away in fear. The man insists it wasn't him who deciphered it, it was the other boy who ended up escaping, which draws a laugh from the commander. Orika says she still believes it was impossible for a white bracelet and would file this case as a big hoax. The man was quite unhappy with how things turned out, but the commander kept walking, wanting to know more about the case, because she heard he was threatened by a weapon that apparently had a peculiar mark on its handle. And the man agrees, saying it was all because of a girl named Chiza, and it was true, begging for them to believe him. There was a girl by that name, a white bracelet, a woman, and soon the commander searches and finds in the data the information she was looking for. When she saw the photo, Orika smiles, seeing she finally found her. Carved weapons with a flower and a skull, believed to be owned by members who kill as a way of living. If they caught her, they could solve this. Meanwhile, Riku found himself in the building wondering where the other men had gone. Then he realizes he saw something and they were walking away, to which Chiza asks him what he was doing. The building had been transformed into something completely different that should have been the office floor, but it had changed a lot since then. That's why he could now understand why they were calling it the Reverse Tower Dungeon, and Tepi appears asking if they were surprised. It was very different from the previous city they were in. The demons had transformed that place into what they were seeing now. Some floors had their ceilings demolished and returned into halls. The interior walls were reinforced with an unknown material, so they couldn't get through them so easily. The material was so strong that they struggled to set up transport to the upper floors. But they finally opened a hole. All it took was some doubt from red and gold bracelet guys to make it possible. In short, the elevator was the only way to cross between the two parts, and you couldn't easily escape from that place even if you tried. But it wasn't all that bad. The materials obtained from looting there helped a lot with real-world development. Tepai ends the conversation because they should move on and keep going. Riku asks if they should enter with them, and the man says there was nothing inside, just a path that leads deeper into the dungeon, but they could keep walking for a while. As they walk, Chiza asks if monsters wouldn't end up appearing there or something like that, and Tepe answers there's no need to worry. That's because they successfully got rid of them. Distant exits, narrow paths, and unarmed newbies caught the protagonist's attention. He felt a bad signal, and Shichi smiled upon seeing the protagonist because they arrived quickly, and thanks Tepe for making that happen. Because he himself had also prepared and finished what he needed, apologizing for making them wait, the monsters were ready. There was a problem to gather so many of them at once. Those were armadillo frogs with 100 health and 10 mana. Chisa didn't know what those things were, and Riku realizes they must be those well-known monsters. He remembers how Himari mentioned the early monsters from the novel and how much preparation they required. The protagonist had been thinking about what they could include, and the girls said they could go with something like armadillos. Their weakness was their soft belly. They were born alone, but could be super annoying to deal with in groups. Riku agrees it was a good opportunity, but he was looking for a more basic and simple reason than that. Then Himari grabbed a frog and showed it to him in her hand, which impressed him. She had a knack for choosing those things without caring. He thought something cuter would have been a better option, and in the present, Riku recognizes those monsters. Their rough skin and spikes were their weapons. They would attack by curling into a ball and rolling toward their targets. At the same moment, the monsters leap at them, and the protagonist immediately knew it was all a trap. But before they could be hit directly by the monsters, each of the frogs was sent flying as attacks came from behind. It was Teppei's attacks using a blue bracelet, firing a highly pressurized mass of water at high speed to defeat the monsters. As he approached, he complains that they gathered two main monsters in just one spot, and Riku doesn't understand what the problem with that was. But then Chisa noticed and was startled by Shuchi's gaze as he drew a knife to show the novice what the big deal was. He hands the weapon to the protagonist. It was what they had promised to lend him for use. It was small, but could still be useful. And he also offers one to Chisa, impressing Riku, because he was pulling knives out of thin air like it was nothing. Shuchi says he had just taken it from his inventory and points to the small box icon in the lower corner of his field of vision. He noticed the semi-transparent icon, and if he looked at it, a window would appear. That was his inventory. He could store anything he held in his hand inside it, and he could try placing the knife he just received in the left corner using his eyes. So Riku decides to try just as instructed and is surprised when he manages to make the weapon vanish from his hands. Shuchi explains that he could retrieve an item by doing the reverse and could also pull out stored items without using the window. And Teppei warns him to stop his little tutorial before he does something worse than that now. Anyway, he didn't know how much longer he'd have to deal with him on his own. He was almost at his limit. To Chisa, it seemed the man was having fun, even though he had been complaining the whole time. Teppei's bubble bracelet allowed him to temporarily restrict his opponent's movements. Then Shuchi decides to explain the rest later during battle and asks what Riku's ability was. Before Riku could answer, Chisa whispers that things would get complicated if he said it and tells the others his power was deciphering, and hers was teleportation, which confuses the protagonist because he had heard it was supposed to be charm or something like that. Ignoring him, Chisa says she could use it within a 1-meter radius, and Riku mentions that it was a very small range, not much different from jumping forward. Immediately, the girl complains because she realized he didn't want to say it from the beginning, and Riku apologizes since he now understood why she was hiding it. Laughing, Shuchi says it all depended on how it was used. Even deciphering had great potential. They were very tense, so he would buff their defense using an item, which meant it would increase their stats for a limited time. Some people could do that using magical abilities, but if no one like that was in the group, they could compensate using scrolls or items. Though their usage was much more limited, as Shuchi explained, Teppei immediately shouted that it was taking too long. He couldn't stand waiting or doing this any longer, and Riku warns that they were coming, so Chisa decides to go ahead and take care of them. Chisa's teleport allowed her to move to the enemy's blind spot in just an instant and deal critical damage. Her teleport, while using a white bracelet, worked like that. She could instantly move to any location within a meter with little mana usage. Chisa began taking care of the monsters and killed them, while Shuchi states that Riku's ability was useless in battle, which he already knew from the start. Even without an offensive ability, as long as you knew the enemy's weaknesses, you could still do something. With Shuchi's encouragement, the protagonist remembers that in the case of the frogs, their weakness was still their soft bellies, so he had a chance to do something. Thus, he manages to attack some of the monsters and even surprises himself, including Shuchi. Riku struck their weak point with high precision, and his physical skills weren't those of a novice. Not even the protagonist knew he could do that. It felt like his body was much lighter compared to before. While reflecting on this, Shiza yells at him to stop getting distracted. The next wave was approaching. The two keep fighting, with the girl reminding him not to show exhaustion or stop so early while many monsters were still appearing. Watching the two, Shuchi was impressed because those two could go far if well trained. Finally, Riku realizes those must be the last of the wave while Chiza sat down, exhausted from fighting. As he approaches, Shuchi praises them because they fought very well while using their abilities. The girl had run out of mana, and that's why she was feeling that way. Mental power, also called mana or MP, could sometimes be abbreviated as mentality points. It was consumed every time an ability was used. Mana consumption manifests as a kind of mental fatigue. Moreover, the feeling of fatigue after concentrating on something for a long time, or the sensation of drowsiness or lethargy from sleep deprivation, is similar to mental fatigue. In more serious cases, people could even faint from the sheer effort made after a battle. When all of your mana is depleted at once, you end up the same way Teppei did, so you should be careful. Then they realized they had dropped something. On rare occasions, monsters could drop items for the person who defeated them. It was a jewel fragment, and items could range from precious materials like metals to gems like this one. Anything left behind in there was yours by right, and Chisa is impressed by how amazing that is. Even jewels could fetch a good amount of money if you gather a large quantity of them, and she asks what it was she had picked up. That one in particular was monster excrement, which makes her throw it far away with a scream of disgust. Shuchi says that demons on the upper floors have a high chance of dropping crystals from their bodies. Riku asks if he was talking about those with humans inside them, and the man agrees that was indeed the case. There were many types of demons that could crystallize humans. Many of them were adventurers or became victims of the reverse day. Putting it under a grim perspective, the most valuable and expensive things left behind were the crystals. The government and potential clients gave huge rewards for them, and because of that, everyone aimed for the front lines at the very top. But Shuchi's personal opinion on that was that guiding adventurers not to recklessly risk their lives should come first before money. Then he approached and gave Teppei a mana potion, which restored about 50% of his mana. Riku apologizes. Frankly, he had suspected him a lot at first, thinking he was trying to trick the two of them and steal their belongings. Shuchi smiles, saying that kind of person also exists, at least based on his experience. But you believe those kinds of people wouldn't be here with the newbies. After all, there was nothing to gain even if they could rob them. And the protagonist ends up agreeing that was true. But again, Shuchi smiles and greets them, saying it was a pleasure to meet them. The two shake hands, now on good terms, and meanwhile Orica arrived outside the dungeon building, watching with interest. She thought the chances of them having gone into the tower were low, but the girl and her accomplice clearly used the elevator. Her men agree with the commander's orders, and she commands them to stop operating the elevator, since then they would have nowhere to run. Still, they ask how they were going to enter, but then are startled because Orica simply jumped away. She decides she would take a detour and come back as soon as she caught them, not even using the elevator to go in after them. And obviously, she would go alone, to which the vice captain agrees. To the other man's shock, it becomes much clearer they were destined to die. When the battle ended, the protagonist asked the men if they had any specific goal for that day. Shuchi says it was nothing special, but there was something he wanted to show them 2 floors above, so they could go in that direction. Riku asks where the other groups had gone since he still hadn't seen anyone, and he replies that there was a base camp set up a little higher up. There was an elevator that led to the camp and to the lower floor, and from their current position, the camp was 3 floors above. These days, most people took the elevator that led directly to the camp without much trouble. After all, you could get much better items on the upper floors, but it was difficult for lower class people to go immediately to those floors. Shuchi says that people generally create a group to gather information in the real world first. There was even an app made for that. People would find companions through it and go straight to the camp floor right away. But almost no one made groups with white bracelets, and Chiza reminds the protagonist how society didn't go easy on them. Riku thought the guild receptionist was just a lunatic trying to scare him or something like that. Then Shuchi says they should rest there for a bit, and the girl agrees since she was starving. Now that he stopped to think about it, Riku realizes he hadn't eaten anything since waking up and been moving around non-stop. Shuchi gave a big smile, saying to leave everything in his hands because food wasn't included at the camp. Then he tells everyone to get ready because it was time to eat, impressing the protagonist because they could actually do something like that. He prepared a picnic with various things to serve, and Chiza never imagined they could fit so much in the inventory. Shuchi explains that as long as it's not alive, not too big, and not too heavy, you could just send it inside. You could even carry food as long as it was in a container, and Teppei gets ready because now was his time to make things work. Although it didn't seem like it, Shuchi was an excellent cook, and Teppei could basically cook anything given to him. Chiza is impressed that he could see well even wearing those sunglasses. She felt like he was the type who'd mix salt with sugar. He could see his intuition just fine, so it was all good. What really mattered was being stylish. There's nothing better than living a swag life. Teppei doesn't take long to finish the quality snack he prepared, and Chiza tries it, agreeing that it really was delicious. Riku was eating better there than in the real world. It almost made him cry, which drew a laugh from the man finishing slicing an apple. Flattery wouldn't get him anywhere. But even so, the protagonist fell for it because Teppei offered apples carved just for him. Then the protagonist asks if it was really okay for them to eat so carelessly like that. And Shuchi replies that the camp setup had a special effect that prevented monsters from approaching, so it was fine. The effect expires after a certain amount of time. The city also had a similar effect. Riku asks if since it hadn't been affected by monsters for 2 years, it must have just kept expanding as far as he knew. Partially, yes, but it was also because countries and companies were competing to control the world. That's why it grew so much. After all, the inverted world was an active territory full of resources, not yet claimed by anyone. In this situation, everyone was searching for those with strong abilities. Even one of them was enough to destabilize things on a national level. Not to mention what a group of them could do. To be honest, there weren't even guarantees that one wouldn't risk their life in this lifestyle. But even worse, everyone was frantically trying not to fall behind. In short, they got used to it. And now they were just going with the flow. Back then, everyone was terrified of being attacked by monsters, or that the world might end. That was until they discovered that purple water stopped the monsters from attacking and kept them from entering the real world. It was because of this need for highly prepared people to fight that white bracelets were discriminated against more than necessary. Chiza grumbles while Shuchi says that if he asks why white bracelets don't form groups among themselves, it's because it was dangerous. As soon as a green bracelet's ability was activated, they were on the upper floors from day one. And you wouldn't generalize it, but many people up there only cared about themselves. No one ever tried to help lower class people improve, and the same could be said for the real world. Even if someone had talent, Shuchi saw many people being discarded without even getting a single chance, which really was a shame. He thought those two could get stronger by gaining experience, even while being in the lower class. That's why Shuchi stopped climbing to higher floors and was adventuring while giving them, the lower class folks, an opportunity, but he still wanted to go further. Shuchi laughed because it was foolish to deny someone's potential without even giving them a chance, which made the other two smile. Teppei says that rising in class could be hard, but it certainly wasn't impossible, and he begins giving another example. He was a white bracelet, just like the two of them. But thanks to Shuchi, He'd been raising his levels on the upper floors and managed to be promoted to a blue bracelet. Although the way Shuchi invited him was also suspicious, so he had his doubts while he was there, and Shuchi ended up laughing. He felt the same way, something like he's going to steal my organs while I sleep. They both suspected each other from beginning to end. But anyway, Shuchi laughed because he was helping, but whether they'd rank up or not depended solely on their ambition. Teppei himself worked hard to get to where he was now. He thought it'd be great if more people were like him, helping each other and working together regardless of class, which drew a shy laugh from Shuchi since he was being praised so much. When he saw them, Riku felt happy to meet such kind people, putting effort into something, trying to improve without knowing if you'd succeed or not was just like in the real world. In that case, they should just keep trying, and Chiza agrees because they'd do it even if they didn't want to. That was the case, he just thought it was a little further up from the place he actually wanted to show them. The whole group kept walking, and Riku was surprised because it really was huge. It seemed like this floor in particular had a reason to be that way. Teppei says they were on the 4th floor of the tower. It might be big, but it was a dead end with nothing around, so not many people were there. What Shuchi wanted to show them was this, and the protagonist was caught off guard because it looked like just a monumental stone. Shuchi replies that no matter the dungeon, all of them have a place like this, and among them, this one was on the lower floors. If they read the engraved letters using the decipherability, they could discover its purpose. He might not be able to do it yet, but he thought it would be a good enough motivation, at least for the future, and Teppei smiled, saying he could tell them where an amazing weapon was hidden or something like that. Then Riku was even more surprised because people couldn't read it. However, he could still use his master level decipher now. And with that, he was able to read it. He could now read and immediately translate it as be qualified. He wonders what that meant, continuing to read the narration about how, if you desire power, you could touch the stone and something would happen. But before he could keep reading, something suddenly falls and fills the place with dust, preventing the protagonist from continuing the reading. Shiza notices that the entrance just collapsed, to which Shuchi says that actually the stones were summoned with magic. When they looked back, they saw a man approaching because things were over for them now. Shuchi asks if it was that man who used the magic to close the entrance, and the man tells one of his other men to lower that thing. He would never forgive him if that thing broke, and the man lowers something hidden by a cloth near the floor. As Shuchi insists on getting an answer, the man says that was a great expression on him, but he didn't need to worry so much. They could end this quickly. It was rare, but sometimes people came down to hunt beginners. Those guys were that type of people. Now their numbers were the same, but there was a class difference. They would try to get out of there without fighting if possible. The other men ask if he finished his strategy meeting, to which the boss says they came from above first. He was excited to see what kind of expression they would make. One of them should be enough for a warm-up, and he sends one of his masked men at Shuchi. Riku shouts, worried about the attack, especially because Shuchi was pierced straight through, and the masked man celebrates for landing a clean hit. Charging in so suddenly was very rude, which shocked the man because he couldn't pull his sword out from inside Shuchi's body. Shuchi might have aged over the years, but he didn't think he could be defeated just because they were young. At that moment, Shuchi counterattacks the man who struck him with full force. Using his green bracelet, he could strengthen his arms up to 3 times more. The strike sent the attacker flying so far that even the boss was surprised, but Shuchi says he held back, so he should still be alive. After all, the items from the man's inventory hadn't dropped, and Teppei knew he'd never lower himself to the point of killing people. Riku and Shiza were caught off guard because that man really was strong. Shuchi would still let them retreat if they wanted, but if they attacked again, he'd show no mercy to any of them, to which the boss screams in shock because that man was truly powerful. Even if he was the only strong one in the group, those two could handle him just the same. They were attacking from several different directions and wanted their items, but Teppei didn't allow the attacks to continue. Their weapons were stolen and placed inside bubbles in the blink of an eye, with Teppei saying that if they attacked, he'd respond in kind. Shuchi handled the rest of them and charged at his opponents. He had warned them clearly what would happen if they acted. Riku was impressed just watching. Those two had so much battle experience they could act like that. Shuchi told them to run for the exit while he kept them busy, but after a while, all the men were defeated, leaving only their boss. And he asks what he planned to do now, only angering the man further as he stutters that he couldn't be underestimated like this. First, he intended to kill the small fry who were getting in the way and trying to escape while the veterans stayed in front. But Shuchi wasn't going to allow that because those two weren't small fry after all. You couldn't keep discriminating against people based on their class. It would only lead them to be mistaken. But little did they expect the enemy's attack to strike Shuchi's leg, and Teppei looked in shock at what had been taken from him. The man only smiled as he watched Shuchi fall to the ground screaming in pain. That was the power of that red bracelet man disguised as green. He could cut off parts of an enemy even from a distance, and the mana required for it was moderate overall. He shouldn't even have seen where the attack came from, and the man reveals he was actually a red bracelet all along, and of course the one he wore now was fake. This was Ryu the Face Hunter, with a red bracelet and a physical ability of body enhancement. Ryu says he let his guard down at that moment. The look of desperation on their faces when the game changed was something he loved. Riku ran in to try and help Shuchi, but he shouted back not to come any closer than that right now. Even against a single enemy, white bracelets were no match for a red bracelet. The same applied to blue ones. Instead, he orders them to run instead of just worrying about him, and Teppei ran to place himself in front of Shuchi. They would never just do nothing. He might not be a match for him now, but if he were gone, there'd be no guide left to help him grow. That's why Teppei stepped in front and attacked Ryu, who tried to defend himself using his combat knife. The protagonist asks to be allowed to help, but Teppei immediately yells no again. He should prioritize getting Shuchi to a safe place. He would handle the rest somehow. And so the two of them followed through, even with Shuchi pleading for his comrade to stop since he couldn't defeat him. The same applied to the two novices. He just wanted the two of them to run, but Teppei intended to show him. This was the moment of kill or be killed, which made Ryu laugh upon seeing that they must be feeling cornered. It was simply magnificent. But even so, he wasn't the only one faking his class around here, and so Riku shouts for Teppei to be careful because an attack was coming from behind him. That was the look Ryu wanted to see, the look of someone afraid, and he took the full punch before flying far away. At that moment, he began being kicked by other men, and Riku ran to try and help him while he was on the ground. Teppei apologizes to his comrade after all that had been done for him. Even in the real world, he was a nobody. He was just enslaved by a company he hated working for. Knave, broken, and without any hope in life. Teppei was one of the worst in the inverted world despite hoping to stand up for himself. And within all that struggle and despair, that's when he met Shuchi. He took him impatiently when he didn't know how to do anything, answering the same questions again and again without getting frustrated. And now it was time for the finishing blow. Ryu intended for his opponent to show one last expression of fear before the end. With his red bracelet, he would use his meteor bomb, which exploded the target into pieces. The mana required was none, since it came from a scroll. The other men ran far away, leaving Teppei on the ground, but the protagonist had no intention of leaving him there. He prepares his attack with a fire blast. Teppei yells at him to stop and not to come any closer than that. And his ability was activated on Riku, who got trapped inside it, unable to move, questioning what he thought he was doing. He asked to be released, but Teppei smiles, saying he at least wanted to look cool in his final moments in front of the newbies. But the protagonist didn't intend to let him die for them after all. He was also an important person, and Shuchi was nearly begging him not to die. Even so, Ryu fired his attack, and Riku concluded that Teppei was a hope, a living proof that people could improve in life. Shuchi begs for him to stop and not destroy that hope, but Teppei smiles, thanking him because he had received such trust until the very end. The explosion happens, and Riku is blown away while still inside the bubble, with nothing left there but Teppei's items. The men saw that he at least had some items with him. It wasn't bad for a mere blue bracelet. The protagonist remembers that someone was alive as long as their inventory items didn't drop. But since Teppei's inventory had dropped, it was clear what had happened. Ryu gets up and even steps on the apples carved by Teppei now that he made him die, even though he wanted to make him suffer a little more. He was an annoying guy, died in such a boring way that it didn't bring even a little bit of relief in his final moments. Shiso approaches Riku, unable to believe that really happened before her eyes, crying over the death she witnessed. Then she's surprised when she sees the protagonist getting up and says she will never forgive him for what he just did. Ryu kept mocking Teppei's death until the very end. He called him someone with a boring life who had a death just as dull. Although Riku's attack reached Ryu, he defended himself without much trouble. He asked if he really thought an attack of that level would work on him, but that didn't matter, because Riku wanted to end him no matter what. Still, Ryu just mocked the protagonist's anger. After all, he was just a small guy with a white bracelet and no worth at all. Maybe he should stomp him out just like he did with that other guy not long ago. Annoyed, Riku responded that Teppei was not pathetic and defended him. The truly pathetic ones were the guys who fought using dirty tricks. Ryu stuck out his tongue, still mocking the protagonist's words. Because winning was all that mattered in this world, no matter what. They were inside the reverse world, where morality was also flipped upside down. Chisa kept driving Shuchi away while Ryu said the weak die. And the dead can't talk anymore, which only tainted Teppei's smiling image. Riku said that just because the world was like this now, it'd mean the value of life should be thrown away. But Ryu couldn't care less about any of the things he defended so strongly. He intended to twist that arrogant expression on his face into pure despair. Some of Ryu's men rushed Riku right away to beat him down, and the protagonist challenged them to try if they really thought they could. He fired his fire magic, and the men shielded themselves with their arms. They realized it wasn't a skill, but a magic spell being fired nonstop. They discovered Riku's fire magic came from a scroll and didn't use mana. One of them decided to create a distraction using his ability to speed up his movements. He told his partner to focus on defense while he ran. If they could force Riku to use everything he had, they might win. The other man had a skill to boost his own defense, but the protagonist had no intention of letting a man get in his way. Magic circled around the running man and trapped them both inside a ring of fire. Ryu felt that something was off now that he was watching the fight. Even if Riku had filled his inventory with a maximum number of scrolls, that limit was 12. But he already used way more fire attacks than that by now. Even being a skill, he hadn't lost his breath, so Ryu couldn't understand what was going on. Maybe Riku had some MP limitation issue or something like that. Shiso was impressed by his power and shouted for him to keep going. The men couldn't understand anything anymore as their surroundings had become a sea of flames. The power just kept growing with no sign of slowing down. They couldn't understand why they were facing a mere white bracelet user. But it didn't take long before the two men were blown far away. Ryu looked on in surprise because the two had been defeated, and they even knocked over a small cage covered with a cloth nearby. The protagonist sighed because now there was only one left to finish off, and Ryu asked what the hell just happened, saying he wouldn't forgive him this time. They ordered their men to get up and take Riku down right now, and one of them used earth magic to trap the protagonist's feet. Ryu took advantage of the moment to punch Riku in the face, who blocked with his arms, but he was still sent flying into a wall. He shouldn't have died from that, but Ryu was going to kill him anyway for hitting the cage earlier. The other man with earth magic launched even more attacks to bury Riku. After all, he was just a white bracelet guy. There was no way he'd win. Shisa screamed the protagonist's name when she saw the place he was in being buried. She asked Shuchi not to move because she was trying to stop the bleeding, but it was hard. And Shuchi pointed out that the men were approaching and now aiming at them. He wanted Chiza to run for her life using the teleport ability. Ryu approached to check if the old man was already dead. Then Chiza apologized before using her teleport, drawing a smile from Shuchi. He thought it was fine that way, and he wouldn't blame her for fleeing to save herself. But Chiza hadn't run. She grabbed a knife and prepared to fight. She used a technique she learned and attacked Ryu, who didn't even feel it. He praised her idea, but said that an attack from someone of such a low rank couldn't even scratch him. His body was reinforced with high-level techniques, and Chiza couldn't defeat him. One of the men grabbed the girl to knock the knife from her hand and stop her from escaping. Shuchi shouted for them to stop, saying he would give them all of his money and items if that's what they wanted. But he cried for Chiza, because she was just a child and had nothing to do with any of this. Ryu laughed, saying that what he offered was impossible to accept. That was because their real target had been Chiza from the very beginning. The others, there were just a warm-up and opening scene. Shuchi couldn't understand why they'd go through all that for such a ridiculous reason. Then they fired magic at Shuchi and crystallized him on the spot. Chiza screamed in desperation when she saw him turn into a small crystal. One of the men smiled, saying they managed to freeze Shuchi with the perfect expression. Chiza saw the monster capable of crystallizing people locked inside the cage they were holding, and Ryu said that this was his well-trained pet named Pachi. It was a bit trickier to care for than regular dogs. Still, he agreed that Shuchi's crystal turned out quite well. Just when he thought he had won, he lost his legs and his companions. All of that had just been a sideshow. They were truly after Chiza. Ryu even took a photo with the crystal to keep mocking the situation. The girl had heard rumors of people who intentionally crystallized others. All there for money, but she couldn't understand such cruelty. Ryu said he loved seeing the faces of people twisted in despair. He even had plastic surgery on himself to make his face look that way. And he showed on his phone several photos of desperate people. Chiza became furious as the man explained that the client wanted Chiza's weapon, and also information about the creator of that weapon in particular. If she went with them quietly, they wouldn't be rough with her on the way. And Chiza remembered being seen when she drew her weapon a while back. The weapon was a limited type, more convenient compared to the others. It was a type of weapon that could shoot bullets infinitely. Anyone would want something like that. But the weapon with a sakura flower and a skull marked on it was truly unique. Ryu told her to hand over the weapon, and she replied they shouldn't underestimate her. No matter what they did, she had no intention of giving up her weapon or saying anything. The man sighed, saying she was quite the stubborn brat after all. The moment people like her gave up was the most entertaining part. That was when Shuchi's role came into play. As a crystal. If they broke the crystal, there would be no return for the life trapped inside. Death was certain, so they would offer a trade to Chiza. She would hand over the weapon, and they would let her walk away alive. But if she refused, she needed to understand exactly what would happen to the crystal. Crystals were tougher than glass, but they weren't unbreakable. Chiza begged him to stop, and Ryu asked what her choice would be. When she stayed silent, Ryu figured she didn't plan to cooperate. But then she screamed, agreeing to give him what he wanted. Still, she couldn't just fire any bullet however she wanted, even if she tried. She picked up the weapon and handed it to the man, apologizing to her older brother. Chiza remembered when her brother asked if someone teased her again for being short. She answered that she fired back 3 times worse, which made her brother laugh. After all, she had a tough kind of luck. It happened right before her birthday. Being short wasn't a bad thing. He knew plenty of reasons why she was amazing. Chiza wanted to go to the reverse world as soon as possible. With the right skills, height didn't matter. But she still couldn't enter because she was under 18. Her brother didn't recommend that place. It wasn't really a safe zone. But if she truly wanted to go, he would support her wish. Flyers began appearing, warning people about that skull emblem. There were assassins carrying such weapons, and they were looking for their owners. When Chiza lost contact with her brother, those warnings started to spread. All of that happened about 3 months ago. She couldn't think of anything else that could have happened to him. Then some people started whispering about the creator of that weapon being among them. Apparently, the person voluntarily turned themselves into the police. The assassin clan had been untouchable until now. The guards were tightening security. Chiza remembered still receiving gifts from her brother regardless. He congratulated her when she became an adventurer, giving her one of those weapons as a present. He asked her to use it in case her ability wasn't enough to handle things. There was no way her older brother could have created such a deadly weapon. She wanted to believe there was a reason behind all of this. Chiza wanted to meet him and ask directly about everything. When Ryu grabbed the weapon, he told her to stop lying like that. Chiza replied that if she could have fired it, she would have done it a long time ago. He inspected the weapon, saying that if it fired without bullets, there was no need to reload. But the fact that the mechanism remained closed meant there had to be a way to activate it. She answered that she'd never heard of anything like that before, and wondered if her brother intended to teach her when they met. Ryu decided they just had to find the code somehow. But access was denied, not even the input screen for the code appeared. Chiza said she didn't know the code, not even the details. But Ryu told her to shut up and stop with the excuses all the time. It didn't seem to be a regular item, now they had to figure out how it worked. Until she remembered, they would just ask her body directly. Ryu ordered his men to take her, which surprised Chiza since they had said something different earlier. But of course, it had been a lie from the beginning, and they broke their promise. Chiza's shocked face instantly drew a smile from Ryu. He would record it for his collection so he could enjoy it later. Since she was a girl too, maybe they'd have a little fun later on. Chiza tried to make them stop, but they held her down to keep her from escaping. She screamed for help from her brother, and suddenly the rocks beside them exploded. When they looked, Riku had come out from under the rubble to help her. Going back a bit, Riku had been blasted away from the collapsing rocks. He didn't understand what had just happened. He should have been crushed against the wall when he was hit full force. Instead, he passed through the passage and avoided being crushed somehow. Thinking back, something had activated right before that. Maybe it was the stone monument that opened the entrance to that place. And the inscription key somehow triggered their entrance there. For the one who bore the right would grant the power to break past their limits. That was when Riku suddenly felt something grabbing him from behind. From deep within his body, a kind of power began to rise. A new figure emerged, and the system recognized the new power awakening. It was called Limit Break, which boosts physical abilities. It seemed that was the reward for deciphering the monument. It was right at that moment he heard Chisa screaming for help, and he couldn't move forward to get out because there were still rocks in front of him. His fire magic was completely useless against that wall of stone, so he thought about the ability he had just acquired. Now wasn't the time to hesitate, and he awakened the ultimate inferno. It was the highest level of fire magic power, and he used it to blast through the stones. His physical abilities also kept increasing greatly. Immediately, the men were shocked that Riku was alive. Chisa shouted that they had turned Shuchi into a crystal, and Ryu told her to shut up. After all, they had managed to destroy his collection and the phone where he kept the photos. Even his monster Pochi was destroyed by the flying rocks. Ryu was furious when he saw that happen, but things were bad enough already. He told Riku that most of the people he wanted to protect were already gone. Even if he had returned, someone with a white bracelet couldn't do anything now. But the protagonist ignored him and simply punched him straight in the face. As Ryu's belongings flew away, Chisa tried to break free from the man holding her. When she succeeded, Riku stepped in and punched the man full force. The other man took a solid punch, while Chisa grabbed the crystal and the weapon. The other two men just stood and watched in shock at what had happened. Chisa ran to get the items, using what little MP she had left to teleport, and she felt like she was starting to collapse after running so much. Riku immediately ran to catch her before she hit the ground and got hurt. Chisa got a little emotional seeing that, but then told him to back off. She also asked what happened to his hair, which had turned red. They could talk about that later, but for now, they had to run. They needed to get somewhere safe now. But the other two men intended to immobilize Riku using stone magic. The protagonist was captured and called an idiot for falling into the same trap again. But he told the guy to shut up and headbutted the attacker to knock him down. Riku hadn't dodged before because there was no need to keep avoiding things. Chisa then shouted for him to be careful because Ryu had appeared behind him. Ryu was furious for having been punched and getting his face messed up like that. Then Riku simply grabbed Ryu's sword like it was nothing. That gave Chisa just enough room to act, and she kicked him hard between the legs, knowing it was a weak point. Ryu fell to the ground, and Riku reminded himself it was too soon for him to pass out. He still owed him something. It was time to test a new technique. He explained that everything he had done so far was just physical reinforcement, but his true skill was the Grandmaster grade Ultimate Inferno, which he would now use. Ryu backed away in desperation, begging for his life as much as he could. He even dropped all of his items on the ground in hopes of being spared. Riku shot back that if Teppei had begged for his life, they still wouldn't have spared him. He had already said why none of them would be spared, and hit the attack dead on. His power even pierced the tower and reached the outside, leaving a crater. Ultimate Inferno allowed him to control flames that burn anything to ash. After using the power, Riku dropped to his knees, seeing that Ryu was still alive. Even so, he couldn't bring himself to kill him and cried, feeling pathetic. It should have been enough, but Riku was frustrated with everything that happened. Teppei would have certainly said that taking lives was never a good thing. Still, the protagonist wanted to believe that he had avenged Teppei's death. Suddenly, a woman appeared at the entrance after finally finding him. There wasn't supposed to be a hole there before, but now one had appeared. And Orica knew it had been made by human hands, asking what all of this was. When Orica asked about the arsonist, Riku realized they were talking about him. He remembered she was the assistant who helped discover people's abilities before. However, he wondered why she was in a place like this now. Orica replied that she just wanted to have a little chat, and suddenly she appeared behind them, wanting to know the full story. Riku was shocked. It seemed like Orica had used teleportation magic. Chisa hid behind the protagonist when Orica pulled out a weapon. Or rather, she drew the power scanner she had used earlier to identify abilities. Even if Riku was a white rank bracelet, he had really good reflexes. Decipher and teleport, as Orica expected, weren't strong enough skills. At least not enough to make that massive hole in the wall. When the protagonist got confused, Orica smiled and introduced herself as a member of the guard. She knew he had participated in the ability assessment that morning. Still, it seemed like he got wrapped up in a huge mess pretty fast. Riku responded that it wasn't like that. They got dragged in by accident. They were attacked by those guys now lying on the floor over there. Chisa told her about the things they did to her body, and how they even recorded it. Orica asked them to summon all up, wanting to know if they came alone. They explained that they had entered the dungeon with two kind adventurers. Those were Teppei and Shuchi, green and blue ranked adventurers. They had treated them well, taught them, and guided them. Then Ryu and his men suddenly appeared inside. Teppei was killed and Shuchi was turned into a crystal by the group. Orica asked if they were able to fight back and if that's how it all happened. While Riku was separated for a moment, Chisa was almost taken away. Orica saw what was behind the monument, and the protagonist explained the power he received from it. And it was with that power that he defeated them. But even so, Orica couldn't believe it. There was no way a white rank bracelet could do something like that. But Chisa insisted it was true. She still wanted proof, and Riku sighed, knowing he had no choice. However, instead of being able to demonstrate the power, he realized he couldn't use it again. That was because Limit Break could only be activated one day later. And even then, it could only be used for 3 minutes a day. There was also a small warning Riku hadn't noticed at first. There was a significant risk, and he probably shouldn't use the power without thinking. When the protagonist went silent, Chisa asked what happened, and he revealed that he couldn't show it now, so Orica concluded he had just lied. The idea of a white rank doing all that alone sounded like fantasy. Besides, behind the monument, there was nothing but the outer wall of the place. Even the section that crossed the point in the hole had nothing beyond it, so it was impossible for Riku to have entered anywhere other than that location. The protagonist sighed. He had no intention of forcing Orica to believe all of this. He didn't care if they called him a liar. He just wanted those men to be judged fairly. He also wanted Shuchi to return to normal as quickly as possible. That Orica could agree with, since forging a bracelet was a serious crime. She needed to hear their side too, and would handle everything properly. At that point, Orica recognized that man's face as belonging to a hunter. She didn't know the full details of the case, but he was guilty of several other crimes. They needed to investigate, including the entire massive accident. But usually those guys operated above the common floors, so it was strange that they would appear on such a low level. Either way, Orica decided they would hear Riku's side of the scroll incident. Riku stammered that he really did use magic, but they all attacked first. Orica confirmed through investigation that it was all in self-defense, but she was now interested in the weapon Chiza was carrying. The protagonist remembered having seen that weapon a little earlier as well. Orica asked if Chiza knew the weapon belonged to an assassin clan. The girl got nervous trying to answer and explain herself, and her vision began to blur, until suddenly she fainted, shocking and worrying Riku. Riku believed she must have used up all her MP since she had fought non-stop. Orica agreed that this was a real problem. She couldn't make her speak now. Either way, she asked if the protagonist knew anything about the weapon. As he stayed silent, his silence seemed to mean no. The weapon Chiza had was enough to be considered a real crime. Riku remembered Chiza saying the weapon couldn't be shown in public, and beyond that, Chiza's older brother was a wanted criminal. If his sister carried the weapon, it was possible she was also a member of the assassin clan. The protagonist objected, saying that shouldn't even be possible. Even if he had known her for long, he didn't believe it was true. She had risked her life to save him, and Riku hesitated for a moment. Orica smiled and asked what was wrong for him to go so quiet. He felt like an idiot. Maybe he was being tricked into revealing everything he knew, but he couldn't help it. Chiza was unconscious and wouldn't open her inventory, but there was a way for Orica to check what was inside it. Riku got worried about what she meant by that all of a sudden. Just because she was a guard didn't mean she could go that far. Then, Orica mentioned Tenmo Kakai. The line of the heavens is vast and wide, nothing escapes it. When the protagonist didn't understand, she said it was a proverb. It meant that evil could be destroyed no matter where it went. Anyway, Orica told him to get out of her way because he was in it. But he refused to move, which made her decide to try stopping him right away. At least that's what she wanted to see, to know if he could actually do it. Orica jumped and attacked Riku with a strong kick to the head. He defended himself even though he felt how heavy the attack was. But she said he still had a long way to go. His consciousness was ready to fade under the blow's weight, but he held on. Even so, Orica thought she had landed the hit squarely, but he stayed awake. Riku was having trouble with his MP even while trying to fight her. He then fired fire spells at Orica, who jumped over them. But she just teleported closer, which left him frustrated. She didn't know he could use those things. He really was an interesting kid. Then she kicked him, sending Riku flying far away instantly. Orica was just toying with him, even if he was tough for a white bracelet. As she approached Chiza, he shouted at her to stop, telling her to back off. He remembered when Himari got hit full force. He hadn't been able to help her back then either. But now it was different. Riku could move and had enough strength. When Orica was about to do her job, she suddenly stopped upon feeling of power. It was the protagonist gathering his strength to fire off an attack, even knowing that Limit Break had risks that didn't matter now. Chiza had risked everything, revealing her weapon and saving Riku's life. This time he would take the risk using a skill that could cost him his life. It was his turn to protect Chiza, and he charged at Orica immediately. She dodged the attack, feeling the atmosphere shift immediately. But now Riku could see more clearly the teleportation ability she was using. Though in truth, it wasn't teleportation. It was extremely high-speed movement and action. It all went beyond normal perception, but now Riku had the ability to keep up with Orica. Even she was surprised to see his movements suddenly improve. Still, the exhaustion from consecutive battles using his power weighed on his body. The protagonist took an attack from behind and was thrown far away. Orica remarked on how careless he was, though he was reacting differently than before. Riku had let his guard down. The longer this dragged on, the worse it would get. She came with another frontal attack, which turned out to be a bluff, and he blocked it properly. Orica was knocked down by Riku, and she realized something really had changed. From the moment his hair turned red, he had gained more speed. He was using some new kind of power that enhanced his techniques. The protagonist had no intention of hurting her, but she hadn't stopped moving. He was immediately caught in a leg lock. The difference in experience was clear, but Riku had no choice. He would have to use his ultimate Inferno magic. After setting him aside, Orica admitted that she had learned enough. He had passed the test, to Riku's shock, who didn't understand what was going on. She revealed she had only been testing him all this time, and she'd had enough fun. The protagonist asked what was going on with Chiza, since she had gone after her so insistently. And Orica explained that she just wanted to be able to talk to Chiza during that time. She planned to wake her up by offering a potion. That's when he realized that it was actually just a peaceful way to awaken her. Orica handed the same potion to him, since he looked exhausted and could drink it to recover. She laughed, saying she never actually said anything about taking Chiza's life. Riku realized that he had given off the wrong impression after all. Then, Orica revealed that she was part of the guard and had to verify the facts properly. Even if she reported everything correctly, she still had to confirm the events firsthand. A bit later, Chiza woke up a little confused and Riku sighed in relief. Orika assured them there was no need to stay on guard, as she didn't intend to harm her. Her boyfriend had made sure to understand the situation from now on. Chiza grumbled and shouted that Riku was not her boyfriend, clearly embarrassed by the misunderstanding. In any case, the protagonist was relieved to see that she was back to normal. Then Orika asked if she could see the weapon Chiza had been carrying until now. At last, she handed over the weapon, saying that it had never actually worked, and she swore that she had never used it to do anything bad in her life. Riku said that if she had truly used it, they wouldn't have tried to flee or silence witnesses. If the weapon had been so powerful as to be considered illegal, they would have used it from the start. Chiza showing the weapon in the store was just to save the protagonist's life. That was because he was about to be hit by a huge spell and would have been hurt. She risked her life to save him. There was no way Chiza could be a criminal. Orika agreed that he had a point, and asked if she could take a look. The girl said the men's target was that weapon. It seemed like they'd been hired by someone. If they had only wanted the weapon, there was no need to involve Shuchi or Teppy. Sure, the weapon was important, but those two had been targeted for nothing. She just wanted to use that weapon as a clue to find her brother. It disappeared in the upper floors of that tower some time ago. Orika figured her brother must be Sakuraba Atsushi, the creator of that weapon, and she agreed, saying she had told the same thing to the guards when she went to the Ardo. But it had ended up being practically an interrogation she got dragged into. The guard apologized for that. There were some rude guards, and she knew it well. Anyway, Orika asked if she didn't have the weapon at that time, and Chiza confirmed it. She received the weapon later at her inn. She didn't know how, but her brother sent it as a birthday gift. Since she was often teased for being small, it tried to help her somehow. Therefore, Chiza wanted to believe that he wasn't the founder of an assassin clan, and she would prove it as soon as she found him. She wanted to believe in her brother. Now Riku could understand why Chiza wanted to reach the top of the tower. Items and weapons made in the Ardu couldn't be brought into the real world. He also couldn't open his inventory in reality. It was a tough system to manage. Trading items was difficult, especially with all the risks of coming and going. There was no real point in walking around with her through the real world. It was clear that the weapon had been sent to Chiza after she entered the Ardu. That's because Orika could tell that this weapon was now a fake. Riku asked what she meant by that, and Orika confirmed that it couldn't be activated. And more importantly, the mark on it was different from the original. So she returned it to Chiza, who was still quite shocked by what she had heard. Instead, she would be taking the crystal in which Shuchi was trapped. Chiza wasn't sure if it was really okay, and Orika agreed. The guard explained that no previous weapon had a heart engraved on the hilt, and since it couldn't be activated, it could probably be called a replica. It was a problem that she had been left with a weapon that caused trouble, but it didn't seem like she had any bad intentions from the start. It was a birthday present, and so Orika couldn't confiscate it. She would let it go this time, but Chiza should be more careful from now on. And she also meant that she shouldn't go showing it off in front of others either. Riku wondered why her brother would send a fake weapon to his sister, and even though Orika confirmed it couldn't be used, it was still odd, because she herself was warning them to make sure it wouldn't be used. Chiza cried as she thanked her, relieved that she could keep the gift. But at least one of them seemed to be okay with that outcome. Either way, that area was going to get noisy soon. Since the city and the field had some access point, word of the incident would spread, and people would start getting curious about the field. But before that, Orika had to seal off the area and call for reinforcements, so she needed both of them, who had nothing to do with this, to leave now. From her position, it would be a problem if it were discovered they had been at the scene. Riku asked what she was carrying, and she showed him a pouch. It was a survival kit, basic gear for all guards to use. After all, they both looked completely exhausted and needed to take care of themselves. But in return, if they found any information about Atsushi, they should report it. Chiza was shocked to hear all this so suddenly, as it was outrageous. However, the guard said this was all just about the weapon replica. It was better to leave the case in Orika's hands since she knew more about it, rather than trusting other guards who might be less reliable. As they should know, there were some rough guards who wouldn't listen to a word they said. And finally, she sighed and ended up agreeing with what she had heard. At that, Riku said they couldn't just leave things the way they were. He asked about Teppy, who had died, and Shuchi, who had been crystallized. He wanted those men to be properly held responsible. The guilty should be punished, and Orika said it would happen after hearing their side of the story. As for the deceased, it was unfortunate, and she would prepare a report after investigating. Riku asked her to do that, and she agreed to return the crystal. After all, Shuchi would receive proper treatment so he could be revived. About a month after returning to reality, the crystallization would wear off. They could return to check on what happened and ensure he was found. It was a great relief. Orika would take full responsibility for the crystal for now. If there was anything left, it was to find Atsushi and get information, especially about the assassin clan that was so heavily sought after. If the information ended up helping eliminate them or prevent future victims, it would help. Riku agreed, saying that his reason for coming there was to find someone on the upper floors. And Chiza realized that was true. Originally, she was just trying to escape. Now that there was no need to run, there was no reason to be with Riku anymore. But he wanted to make up for what they had done to her and to Shuchi. They could work together to search for information on Atsushi, and Chiza agreed, so the two of them would continue working together as adventurers. And they would climb to the upper floors of the tower to get more information. Orika agreed that by staying together, they could remain safe. But first, they should head to the camp immediately. They could visit an informant Orika herself used to work with. They might know something about the crystal she was looking for. Chiza helped Riku so they could leave and head upward, but before they left, Orika called him. She gave him a piece of advice. He shouldn't show that power of his in front of others. This world wasn't kind to those who possessed such power. Those who tried to use it for good would be targeted by others, who would try to eliminate him out of precaution or simply for fun. If he ended up revealing his power, all kinds of risks would follow. Now the issue was keeping everything safe so it wouldn't remain a secret. But in any case, they just needed to be extremely careful. Riku felt that Orica must be dealing with a lot, and he thanked her. The two of them left, and Orica stayed behind to wake the men who had been left there. Ryu had no idea what was happening and froze when he saw the guard in front of him. Orica prepared to strike and drew a weapon that bore the skull emblem. The pair kept fleeing, and Shiza asked if Riku knew where to go now. He replied that he had found a secret passage thanks to Orica. She said that if they left through that room, no one would be able to see them. That was because the entire place would be thrown into chaos after the hole blown in the wall. Meanwhile, people at the mid-level camp were watching the recording from the inverted tower. They saw Riku's power creating the hole and wondered what kind of thing could do that. They wanted to go out and see what it was, but were worried it might be a monster. They wanted to check it out before the guards sealed off the area and access was blocked. If they could recruit people to the team, it would make things a lot easier. Still, they wanted to follow the trail. The person who did this had to be nearby. The adventurers hurried, wanting to find whoever was responsible. They reported everything to headquarters, and obviously the camp went into panic. They pushed the matter further onto the next day's schedule. With the level of attention from the adventurers, if it was a person, they'd be someone flashy. If it was a monster, it'd be a serious problem depending on the situation. First, the guard had to gather more information on everything that happened. If they could find the source, and if it was a person, they tried to recruit them. Information kept spreading and more work was dumped onto people. They didn't know exactly which floor it had happened on. They believed it was the fourth. The guard had shut down access to the lower floors, so it was likely nearby. They doubted it was a monster because one couldn't be that strong on low levels. People kept questioning things more, trying to figure out exactly who did it. They were still investigating, but had received reports from Orica. They needed to call an emergency meeting. Only captains could respond. They would be there in case any kind of threat or incident occurred. In any case, they wanted the source of the power to be handled with care. But they still wondered who it was. If it were really that strong, it could be a problem. It could end up causing even more chaos throughout the entire city. Some people thought it looked like some kind of fake movie recording. Whatever the case, if they didn't recruit the person, it would be a real threat. If they couldn't be caught, they might have to be eliminated outright. Who or what had caused such an attack was something everyone wanted to know. The scene was said to have happened on a floor where beginners usually were. Watching the news, Kagami started wondering if it had been Riku who did it. She felt like she should have dissected him when she had the chance. Meanwhile, the pair arrived at the place where they'd heard about Orica. Riku confirmed it was where some adventurers or monsters could be found, but it was a much smaller number compared to the previous floor. Shiza mentioned that it was probably night outside, and Riku was surprised. After all, even this other world had things like day and night changes. But since the color of the sky was strange, they might not feel it like in the real world. Meanwhile, Ryu asked how that guard could have a weapon with that emblem. Orica said it was just a detail. If he was desperate, it would be enough. But that he recognized her hair color. Among the guards, she was one of the crazy ones. Once she found her prey, she would hunt them down without a single failure. Just like a maritime gangster, her nickname in the guard was Orca, but her real name was Orica. That's what people called her. While being threatened, Ryu begged her to wait, saying he'd tell her everything about his client. There had been a madman there, someone who broke open the wall in just 1 second. But before he could talk about the client, Orica said that was enough. She already had a good idea who his client might be. Then she offered him the weapon with the emblem, telling him to attack with everything he had. If the strongest among them managed to defeat her, she would let them go. When Ryu grabbed the scythe, he didn't know what was happening. His stats had increased to a terrifying level. If he could combine their powers, he'd be unstoppable. Besides, she didn't even know what his skills were. If he stayed calm, he could win. So he just grabbed one of his men and threw him in Orica's direction. He was shocked because his boss had used him as a distraction to launch an attack. Ryu used his scythe and turned the man into a weapon against Orica. She took the hit while the other men were left confused. After all, Ryu was attacking through one of his own subordinates. But as long as they could win, he didn't care in the slightest. Losing an arm was just a small price to pay. He wasn't used to wielding that weapon, but he still had 2 more meat shields. Things were getting fun for Ryu, but boring for Orica. In the blink of an eye, all their heads went flying at once. Orica asked if they really thought they'd live after using that weapon. Even her own allies didn't know anything about this. But it wasn't like they could hear her anymore, and Orica discarded them. Even though she used an injury as an excuse, they should return now. When she struck the wall, Orica confirmed that there was no room behind the monument. She withdrew to file a delayed report. The signal there was bad, and she'd share the details later. She had encountered an unknown individual and ended up getting injured. She believed they were the one who made the hole in the wall inside the floor. But even Orica hadn't seen their true form up to that point. The lower floor would remain sealed off carefully as required. Since the hunter Ryu and his team had been there, they would send reinforcements for lockdown. As a precaution, it was likely the real culprit had already fled. At that moment, Orica decided to give the true culprit a codename, and they would call this culprit the Ghost. Meanwhile, Riku himself had no idea how things ended up like this. He was exhausted after everything that had happened that day. Truth is stranger than fiction. That's what people usually said. But even so, it all felt far too strange when seen this way. His story with Himari made him wonder where things were going from here. Later, the person who had ordered Riku's capture realized they had failed. That person was the protagonist's childhood friend, President Akutsu. His subordinate apologized to Yozora Akutsu, who didn't want to hear more of it. He just wanted more details, everything they had. They were supposed to ensure the target's safety as soon as the hospital report arrived, even though they had received permission from the hospital director as a courtesy. Still, Akutsu couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong, and ordered his subordinate to explain, once and for all, what had happened. They had sealed all exits. The target still managed to escape through the service entrance. They ended up finding traces of someone who had helped in the escape. They pursued them into the Ardo-yu, but unfortunately got caught up in an incident. And as more people gathered, they lost sight of the target. They searched the entire city afterward, but couldn't find him. It was possible the targets had entered the tower, and they lost sight of them quickly. Akatsu understood the situation and said it was enough for now. They specialized in dealing with things in the real world, so they should leave argue matters for others to handle. And he told his subordinate to shut up when he tried to say he could do better next time. Akatsu stated there wouldn't be a next time now that things had come this far. He'll decide their punishment later once everything was resolved. They must be tired of dealing with argue matters, and he told him to go rest. The subordinate withdrew, and Akatsu sighed, realizing they had underestimated Riku. He had been bedridden for 2 years, but his body was still in top shape. The most important report mentioned that there had been no loss in his muscles, much less in his abilities compared to his condition 2 years ago. Akatsu had visited Riku in the hospital and checked his belongings. Kagami explained they had been found with him. Nothing else was discovered inside the floor where the incident happened. Those items were found along with his injured arm. Someone must have helped stop the bleeding, but Akatsu froze, because he found a handkerchief that belonged to Himari, and he was in shock. If that were the case, he didn't know why Riku had something like that in his possession. Akatsu couldn't believe the protagonist had been with Himari before. She had avoided all contact with Akatsu since their school days. He'd wondered if Himari was actually still on the other side of the reverse tower. That was because Himari Hinamoto was Akatsu's fiancé and he had kept her handkerchief ever since. So he had no intention of giving up. He would save her no matter what. To do that, Akatsu wanted to hear everything Riku might know about her. And so he made a call to release the legend into the Ardo. This person in question was the hero who conquered the tower, Ajito Samagami. That's why Akatsu called Ajito, so he could be set into motion. He explained that his objective was to capture Riku and bring him back alive. Ajito asked if it would be okay to crush his eyes along the way, and Akatsu fell silent, remembering how they used to play together as kids. But he had always been jealous of how Himari was much closer to Riku. So now he didn't care if Riku showed up blind. As long as he could still speak, that was all that mattered to him now. Ajito laughed. It was really terrifying after all, to do something so cruel to a childhood friend. If it were him, he said he'd probably cry, or so he claimed, clearly mocking the situation. Ajito had taken down the previous subordinate with such ease that it surprised the man. His abilities couldn't even be activated in the real world, and yet he had that much strength. But it was precisely because of that Ajito could do whatever he wanted inside the tower. Still, even with the subordinate's protest, Ajito was annoyed. After all, he had received permission from the president to do as he pleased in the real world. In fact, the whole mess had happened because they didn't do their jobs properly, and now they left it in his hands to deal with the useless subordinates. In response, Ajito ordered the man to bite the ground in front of him. He couldn't take the lives of those people, but if he could make them do something humiliating, it was worth it. Ajito laughed in surprise when the man actually did it, complimenting his effort. But despite having promised that just to put him at ease, it was obviously a lie. Later, Ajito called his boss to report that he had finished the job as usual. While walking down the street, some girls recognized Ajito and got emotional. They always watched his live streams and thought he was amazing, even wanting to take pictures with him. Meanwhile, Orika was making her way back out of the tower. She greeted the vice captain after finishing her tasks inside. When asked about the weapon, she said that just as expected, it was real. The owner seemed harmless, so they should just keep an eye on him for now. They might contact him soon, and she had sent a few members to watch over him. Suddenly, a man appeared shouting to speak with the captain. He was worried because he'd heard that she had gotten hurt inside the dungeon. He even yelled when he saw that she really had gotten injured during her mission to the tower. People called her a gangster and emotionless, but she was still a delicate woman. The vice captain apologized for the mess, and she replied that it was fine. But beyond that, he said there was a summons from the commander of the guard. It was probably about the case involving the so-called ghost. Orika understood the situation, but since she was in a good mood, she decided to go along. Meanwhile, Shiza woke up after having a good rest through the night. She was starting to get dressed when Riku woke up as well. She screamed in shock because for some reason, he was sleeping right next to her, and he shot back that he didn't have a choice. It was the only tent available. Riku ended up getting kicked outside without a chance to argue. Shiza couldn't believe that coworkers could function like that. Still, she knew that he had helped her a lot during those past few days, but she hadn't even managed to properly introduce herself after everything. Then she began talking again about her brother's case with Riku. They had lost their parents, and her brother started taking care of her. They weren't wealthy, but at least they managed to survive. Creation was his special ability, and it was well known around there. However, she suddenly lost contact with him after a while. After getting some information, she found out he was likely inside the tower. More specifically, on the upper floors of that tower. Riku understood that she was looking for guildmates to reach the top, and she agreed, though no one helped her except him. Then he told her he was in the same situation because he was looking for someone too. Due to his weakness, he had watched that person turn into a crystal right before his eyes. Shiza got confused because he had said it was his first time in the Ardo, and yet he saw someone become a crystal. Riku agreed because he was on the floors during the big day when everything happened. He was with his childhood friend back in school. He had said some really awful things to her. They drifted apart after that, and when they reunited, they got caught in the incident. When he tried to escape with her, she protected him and turned into a crystal. Riku reflected that things might have been different if he hadn't provoked them. If he'd had changed his target from Himari much earlier, it was all his fault. Because of her judgment, a serious problem occurred and she got hurt. There had to be a way to fix things, and he was determined to save Himari. Shiza asked if he loved her, and Riku stammered that it wasn't like that. But if she was that important, she asked why he never spoke up, even from afar. And he explained that Himari had moved abroad after everything happened. Shiza insisted. there were social networks and ways to reach her. And Riku understood her point. He truly wanted to apologize properly. But unfortunately, nothing worked. He figured she must have hated him deeply. Yet when they met, he didn't feel any of that coming from Himari. Meanwhile, Akatsu was at home sighing because he was always busy. He would end up having to deal with new problems all at once. That included the chaos caused by the attack of a monster or some suspicious person. During a call, he requested that they'd bring him back because he seemed very special. He was the only one who could even do something like that. They should contact him as soon as possible. He had high hopes. Kagami was on the call after hearing all this in order to retrieve Riku. Meanwhile, the duo was still inside the dungeon when the protagonist noticed Shiza's gaze. He was confused until she commented that he was pretty ordinary, no matter how much she looked. That was almost rude in Riku's opinion. Shiza always wondered how it was possible. He was just a white bracelet and could still use the decoding skill. And yet he got stronger when his hair color changed. Besides that, he claimed to be a survivor from the upper floors and had survived the fall. Riku knew all those things were indeed strange. At the time, she was really desperate, trying to get the crystal from a high-floor monster. He thought he had died in the fall, but when he hit the water, his body felt light, and he barely felt the impact. It was like being enveloped by something. When he realized it, a window appeared saying he had acquired the decoding ability. Riku felt that something different had happened and wondered what it was. Shiza asked if he received the skill as a reward for killing the monster, and he agreed that maybe that was the case. Maybe he also gained combat skills and stamina from that experience, because he had never moved like that on any other day before. She felt like he was holding back a lot of things, but it didn't matter. Since Riku had the skill, it meant he could maybe understand other monsters, and he responded that it was because he was the true author of WR, which completely caught her off guard, because that was weird. She asked how many stats he had, and Riku sighed. He knew this would happen. Besides, the author of the novel was the CEO of Arcade 2. Everyone knew that. After all, he had used unpublished web info to clear the tower. For example, he used a strategy to defeat the first floor boss, which was tough. And Riku could understand that because it was their novel, and they knew it better than anyone. The centipede could regenerate even if its head was destroyed, so you had to defeat it by hitting the tail, like the Otoshi Daruma game. Riku had made many strategies that weren't online but were written in his notebook. But now, without the notebook as proof, he couldn't prove the ideas were his. If that were the case, the knowledge in his head would be his only advantage. Clearing the tower would be proof that he was the author. He couldn't just let them steal his work. Shiza ended up agreeing even if she didn't fully understand what he was talking about. Meanwhile, some workers were heading to their jobs on a crowded path, but they noticed the elevator had stopped. There seemed to be some malfunction. Then they saw the presence of the legend known as Ejino Samigami, and they wondered why he was there. This was a worker's elevator. It looked like he was finally planning to help clear the tower somehow. If the monsters disappeared, they could work with more safety. People even started cheering for Ejiko, not knowing what it was really about. He thanked everyone for their support, promising he would do his best during the job. Even so, Ejito always found it a pain, and it was part of his act. He was only using the elevator because Riku used it too. It had been some time since he had gone to the other side of the tower. The first tower had been handled thanks to the existence of that notebook. About a year and a half ago, when they began clearing the tower, everyone followed Akatsu's words and killed the giant centipede boss. The group came together to kill a monster, even terrified because it was huge and strong. That was a massive monster capable of immediate regeneration, and it had a counterattack if it wasn't struck in a specific order. The group quickly noticed that Agito had disappeared. It looked like he had fled. That's when everyone was frozen in place by Agito's ice magic and couldn't move. But not only them, the boss was also frozen by the same magic. Agito thanked them because thanks to them acting as bait, he managed to take it down. It had happened just like it was written in the notebook. It once took 36 elite fighters to bring that thing down. But Agito managed to do it alone using only magic. Still, even he couldn't defeat the immortal enemy on the upper floors. But there had to be another rule to take it down. With the right information, it was possible. However, the notebook stolen by Akatsu was incomplete. Even so, he was desperate to clear the tower for the sake of his fiancée. And the key to clearing it lay in the knowledge that only Riku, the original author, possessed. Agito knew Akatsu made a mistake in claiming to be the true author. No wonder he was starting to get desperate after a while. And now Agito realized he could just steal the author for himself. Even if he resisted, he could be captured and forced to talk. After that, clearing the tower would be easy. If that happened, Agito's influence would rise even higher than it was now. He didn't care about the CEO's pride or his wife. He wanted it all. He intended to turn this entire world upside down once and for all. Meanwhile, the group of men had gathered to search for Captain Orica. She had said she had something to do and went straight to the second floor. She insisted on doing it alone, since it was a promise she had made. She was now at the guild headquarters, where Orica relayed the information she knew. She handed over Shuchi's crystal so it could be recovered along with his name. There was an opening in the regeneration area. They could transport him later that day. And she agreed, saying she'd bring more information when possible. She also listed the names of Riku and Chiza so they could visit him. The next part was one she hated, the death certification office. Upon entering the place, Orica found the area as crowded as usual, and she met the guild receptionist, Nakajiri Jen. Jen asked why she was there, and Orica said she had to handle some paperwork. It was a bit shocking that the captain herself would do this, but it was part of her job. After all, she was also a guard, and if it were up to him, He'd have it done quickly. She handed over Tepe's bracelet, which they used to verify identification. They used the material to identify and read information about the person. Some parts were missing, but the face was still clearly recognizable. Jen saw that the guy had died, and Orica confirmed he was tricked and killed by Ryu. He had been protecting some white-ranked newcomers, which frustrated Jen. She was surprised. It seemed like he knew him, and Jen explained that it was different. He remembered him from a record dated 6 months ago, actually. That was because 6 months ago, Jen had said there was no point in doing such a dungeon. Since Tepe used water magic, there was a chance he'd run into trouble. But there were countless white-ranked bracelets like him at the time. Jen thought he should accept his bad luck and return to the real world immediately. Instead, Tepe scolded him, saying he had no right to criticize what he was doing. Even if his rank was low, he would handle it however he could. Jen said that only a tiny fraction of white-ranked adventurers were actually useful. That was because the vast majority of them died before even being recruited. Still, Tepe didn't care. He was fine with dying while climbing. His body and mind were breaking down. Even breathing could become difficult. That place was where those who climbed rarely ever returned, and they knew it. Everything inside was new. It was a refreshing beginning. To Tepe, that was the Ardo. It was the true hope of his life. If he hadn't gone through that, he probably would have ended everything long ago. And Tepe alone approved of himself. He'd live the life he wanted and die like that. That was his result. Even with weak skills, he would face whatever came his way. Jen didn't want to hear that from someone who thought they were so great. Still, Tepe had no issue with someone trying to look cool. He'd survive with the power he received and return triumphantly. Now Jen was impressed that Tepe had become a blue rank bracelet. Protecting other white ranks, he had done exactly what he wanted from the very beginning. He was always showing himself to others, and Orica could understand Jen's reaction. He tried to push Tepe away and scare him with his words before. But still, people never stopped aiming for the top, even knowing the risk of the fall. Because there was something greater they wanted to reach, something more important. If someone wouldn't listen to reason, all they could do was support them with everything they had. And Jen sighed, eventually agreeing with a smile. Meanwhile, the workers didn't know what to do. After all, the elevator had completely frozen, and they had no idea how to fix it. Back with Orica's men, it seemed she had decided to join a mission. She saw the scene after the incident, and given the scale, they couldn't avoid getting involved. They were shocked when they heard about the huge hole in the wall. They thought it was some weird rumor, but it was confirmed to be real. It was a place where the captain and the legend had a great battle. Apparently, the current camp only existed thanks to that massive hole. Others didn't believe it because it just sounded like a stupid rumor. But it was true that Ajido and Orica didn't have a good relationship. They were said to always fight for dominance in the ocean like a shark and an orca. Either way, all they could do for now was pray that they wouldn't fight. Even so, they started feeling a bit of cold approaching. When they looked, they saw Orica had appeared, realizing Ajido had arrived. She didn't know he was coming, and even some of her subordinates ran away to avoid trouble. Others stayed to greet Ajido, all smiles. But the two who were never supposed to meet ended up seeing each other right then. They went straight toward each other without a pause, all of a sudden. Meanwhile, Chiza commented that somehow everything felt kind of still. Tepe's food had been delicious, and she missed it. Also, Shuchi had always been very kind to them the whole time, but Chiza herself couldn't do anything to stop what happened. Riku also felt things could have turned out differently if he had gained power earlier. Even frustrated, he began eating quickly, which surprised her. He obviously wanted to use the power he gained to save Himari. But if someone else was in trouble, he wanted to be able to help them too. He wanted to believe those possibilities existed and that they would support each other. Just like those two had supported them in the past and worked hard to help. A person's strength wasn't in their rank, and they were proof of that. And to honor their efforts, it could become the strongest white bracelets. But first, they needed to eat and grow stronger. Compared to him, who used to feel full just from the restaurant's steam. This kind of thing was a real meal, and Chiza laughed, calling him an idiot. She promised that she would also get stronger and started eating. The food was good, but she still wished she could get her weapon to work somehow. Riku knew that just owning it was still a crime, even if it seemed powerful. Chiza mentioned it was only a possibility that it was a crime. In fact, when she explained the situation, she had returned the weapon anyway. Normally, she kept it a secret and hid the weapon because it was a problem. Riku thought maybe Orica was actually being protective of Chiza. Or maybe it was just to test his power at the time. Maybe he didn't even have to use his strength to break his limits from the start. It felt like Orica had played with his emotions and made him expose himself. Either way, he said he could use it if he really thought it was possible. Chiza fiddled with the weapon's lock. By doing that, it would carry the strength of many people. That was when she touched the same part that Orica and the others had touched before. If it was a biometric reader, there was a chance it would only work with Chiza. And in fact, her identity was confirmed and the weapon was unlocked. Her brother had modified the lock on her room to use fingerprint recognition, so she figured the same thing might have been done to the weapon. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.